She was a strong-willed survivor who stood up for others.
To see her mother murdered made her who she was.
She became an advocate for victims of domestic violence.
She's like, I'm not going to ever let this happen again.
But instead, she also met a horrific end.
They saw what looked like a head.
We don't know if it's body parts.
I just chopped this girl up.
What kind of an animal does that?
All the signs point to domestic violence.
This was a crime of passion.
You are going to look at the boyfriend.
He was very obsessive with her.
Those red flags definitely can escalate.
Or was her death collateral damage?
It was just in her nature to try to help.
There was a domestic dispute that got physical.
Her friend is trapped.
Screaming. Help me.
August 24th, 2018. It's a sunny Friday morning in the Bronx, New York City's northernmost borough, and home to landmarks like Yankee Stadium and the Bronx Zoo.
People were enjoying themselves. It had been a little rainy a few days before, so people were just getting out.
Many of them are heading a few blocks south of the zoo to Crotona Park.
This is one of the biggest parks in the Bronx. You got kids playing.
And Parks Department employees are working hard to keep things clean.
They were going around picking up trash when one of them noticed a couple of bags dumped on the side of the road.
Which would not seem like a big deal in a park. There's trash bags all the time.
But when the park worker investigates, it's soon obvious she's dealing with more than just illegal dumping.
She went over to the bag and opened it, and inside saw what looked like a head.
She immediately calls 911.
911, where's emergency? I'm calling from the Parks Department, Crotona Park South and Franklin Avenue. We need PD because we have two big plastic bags and with hair in it, so we don't know if it's body parts.
Hey, go ahead, back up.
Police came, they opened the bag, they saw there was some body parts inside.
The victim appears to be a young Hispanic female.
The body's decomposing. They couldn't identify who this person was.
NYPD 8713. Start Major Crimes are our location. Got a deceased Hispanic female, 20s to 30s. Check and see if you have an error.
But when the officers ask dispatch to run a missing persons check, they get a tentative hit.
A Bronx woman had just been reported missing by her family 2 days earlier.
Got one hit, a 25-year-old, Lisa Marie Velasquez.
Lisa Marie Velasquez had known a lot of tragedy in her young life.
When she was 12 years old, she was in an apartment with her mother and two younger siblings when her mother's ex-boyfriend broke into the apartment.
The ex-boyfriend had stabbed and killed her mom in front of Lisa and her siblings.
Just to know that the kids witnessed this, it devastates me. No child should endure this. They still have their nightmares.
But Lisa never let her childhood trauma limit her.
After her mother's murder, Lisa and her siblings moved in with their grandmother.
Grandma was at that stage that she had just retired. So Lisa had to take the role of mother, father, and everything in between.
Both of her younger siblings were also special needs, which added to Lisa's level of responsibility.
It was difficult. When Lisa would talk to me about it, she used to cry. She goes, I don't know what to do. I'm lost.
But Lisa never gave up on the people she loved.
Lisa was a loving, a nurturing, a giving person. If you was in her heart and she loved you, she would have died for you.
Her mother's tragic death also triggered a deep commitment to protecting others.
She wanted to work and help with people in the community. She became like an advocate for victims of domestic violence.
She volunteered here all over the place, and I'm like, this child is amazing.
she's a remarkable, beautiful young human being who will just give everything to the world.
And she hoped to turn that dedication to service into a career.
She was in the ROTC. She was in the cadets.
She wanted to become a cop.
That's the brotherhood, sisterhood. People wrap their arms around you. They teach you to protect yourself.
But the memory of her mother's death also led Lisa to keep people at arm's length.
Lisa tended to always be very guarded in her relationships.
How'd it go with Chris the other night? Girl, I canceled on him last minute. Okay. Yeah.
It took a while for me to break down those walls that she felt comfortable enough to talk to me.
That was especially true when it came to men.
Lisa always had different boyfriends.
But she was reluctant to commit.
His vibe shifted. I don't know. It was off. I was not feeling it.
She was always go with the vibe. So if your vibe was great, that's how, you had a chance.
And there was one man whose vibes broke through the barriers Lisa built around her. Antonio Wagner.
Hey, excuse me. Is anyone sitting here?
No, actually. Please, take the seat.
Thank you.
He adored Lisa, and he was very attentive to her.
Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Doing great.
They did love each other.
Lisa was like, I'm moving out my grandmother's house. I'm moving in with my boyfriend.
It looked like she was finally starting to put her past trauma behind her.
But now, it looks as if she may have suffered an even more gruesome fate than her mother.
Police believe the dismembered remains discovered in Crotona Park could be Lisa.
When somebody's dismembered, you have a super messy crime scene.
But despite the horror she suffered after death, there's no disguising how she died.
Her skull showed signs of severe blunt force trauma.
This was not like a robbery where somebody, just shot or stabbed.
The killer went through the trouble of cutting up her body.
What kind of an animal does that?
This was, in criminology terms, a crime of passion.
After witnessing her mother's murder as a child, 25-year-old Lisa Marie Velasquez had devoted her life to helping others escape a similar fate.
She was physically present, but she couldn't do anything. She was a 12-year-old girl cowering. So now, in her mind, she's like, I'm not going to ever let this happen again.
She always mentioned how it was very important to always be there for friends.
She's a loving person, and she was just giving her all.
But now New York police believe they've found her dismembered body in the Bronx.
A maintenance worker found a body dumped in Crotona Park.
They knew this was a young female Hispanic.
And Lisa's family had reported her missing 48 hours earlier.
It will require an autopsy to determine if the remains are Lisa's. But there's little doubt how the woman died.
The woman's skull had suffered severe blunt force trauma.
Usually when you have a victim that has been murdered in such a horrific way, there is a heavy investment from the person that did it. It is typically someone that knows the person. It's a personal thing.
But can the detectives identify the killer?
At that point, they didn't even know where the murder occurred.
But there's other evidence that's always left behind. When you're stuffing body parts in a bag, fiber from your hair, your clothing, that's going in there. There's tons and tons of other things that are left behind as clues.
Detectives have the bags and body parts removed from the crime scene for forensic analysis and autopsy.
They took the bags out. They brought the bags to the medical examiner.
So now the forensics team can go ahead and do their job.
Then detectives conduct a quick canvass of the onlookers.
Since it was a pretty, busy day in the park, people started congregating over to see what's going on.
But while there are plenty of people in the park that day, the detectives come up empty-handed.
No one saw anyone dropping off the garbage bags, which led police to believe they were dumped overnight.
With no leads from the scene, the detectives pay a visit to Lisa's aunt, who'd filed the initial missing persons report.
Police want to talk to people who knew the victim.
Hi, are you Ms. Rivera?
Yes.
We need to ask you a few questions.
The detective, when she showed me her card that it said homicide, I knew.
Oh, God.
She confirms that she had been the one to report Lisa missing.
When was the last time you saw her?
Tuesday, we spent the whole day together.
We went window shopping, went into the Chinese restaurant, then we went back to the front of our building. We have handball courts, swings, and all of that. So we played a little bit of handball. We spent that whole day together from 9 o'clock in the morning, I think it was 8-something in the evening. The best day we've had. The best day we've had.
Lisa and her grandmother lived in the same building as her aunt, on one of the upper floors.
She was gonna go upstairs to take a shower, and that was the last I saw of her.
It wasn't until the next morning that she knew something was wrong.
Lisa normally calls me between 6:30 and 7 on the dot, because I'm downstairs by 7. And we would meet, we would sit in front of the building and have coffee. This was for the last 2.5 years, every single day. For some reason, I didn't hear from her. So I know something was up.
Lisa wasn't answering her phone either.
But I still hadn't heard from Lisa that whole day. The following day, I go upstairs and Lisa was nowhere to be found.
Her grandmother hadn't seen or heard from her either.
She said that it was very unlike her because she was a very, very responsible person, and when she didn't get in touch, they reported her missing.
When detectives head upstairs to talk to Lisa's grandmother, she also says she last saw Lisa on Tuesday night.
When she got home, she took a shower and went to bed.
But then, at around midnight, someone had called her.
She started packing some stuff, ran out saying she had to go help a friend. Lisa had a friend, Sierra Martinez. It's somebody she met when she was in school.
She only said good things about Sierra.
She says it's Sierra's boyfriend that's the problem.
And Lisa has told me that he beat Sierra.
Marie Velasquez's family. The 25-year-old rushed out of her grandmother's apartment in the early morning hours of August 22nd to help a friend in need.
The family believed that the friend that she had gone to help was 30-year-old Sierra Martinez.
It would be just like Lisa to go running to help Sierra.
She was always there for her.
She would help even a stranger to no end.
But had her determination to help a friend cost Lisa her life?
A maintenance worker discovered the dismembered remains of a young woman in Crotona Park.
The torso and the head were found, and it was very, very hot, and the body was decomposing.
Confirming that it was Lisa would require dental records or DNA.
And while waiting for the medical examiner to establish the victim's identity, the investigation continues.
Police started to try and find out, well, where did she go that night when she ran out of the house at midnight?
So you think she went to Sierra's house?
I know she did.
But Lisa never came home, so her aunt reported her missing.
You think Sierra's boyfriend had something to do with this?
I wouldn't be surprised.
I kept telling her, stop getting in everything, Lisa. You can't save the world.
Or could there be another explanation?
When you do have a murder like this, typically it would be somebody that is either a spouse, significant other, or boyfriend.
Was Lisa seeing anyone?
Yeah, she was dating a guy named Antonio Wagner.
They were living with each other about a month or two, give or take.
But things didn't last.
They had an argument at some point that he threw her out, and she never went back.
Threw her out, like physically?
No, it wasn't like that.
It wasn't a violent relationship, but they had their arguments.
Still, Lisa's aunt says she was happy when the relationship ended.
He's very obsessive with her. Like, he wanted to know where she was at 24 hours a day. He's calling 20 times a day.
The individual definitely has some anger management issues, potentially some narcissistic personality traits.
Okay. Well, that's all for now. We're going to follow up on this and we'll be in touch.
Thank you, ladies.
That may or may not mean that Antonio is their killer. But when the detectives get the results of the autopsy, one thing is certain.
The medical examiner identified the body as belonging to Lisa Marie Velasquez.
The autopsy also adds additional details about how she died.
She was hit over the head more than a dozen times with probably a hammer.
Then, once Lisa was dead, the killer had dismembered her body.
According to the medical examiner, the cuts were rough with ragged edges, indicating a large blade or a cleaver was used.
That's not dismembered with a little knife. That had to be something like a sword, machete, or something else.
When details of the murder appear in the local media, the news hits the community hard.
Well, it does have a psychological impact in the community because this case was quite shocking.
But no one is more shocked than Lisa's friends.
That was one of the worst days of my life. I was checking through social media, and that's when I found out that Lisa was murdered. I couldn't believe it.
Lionel told me that Lisa's dead. I paused. Like, everything literally just stopped. I just couldn't breathe. I fell into a very, very dark place. I really broke down and I cried.
And there is one friend of Lisa's that the detectives definitely want to talk to. Sierra Martinez.
According to Lisa's family, she was heading to Sierra's apartment on the night she went missing.
She got a call from Sierra, who was very upset, and Lisa, being the friend that she was, just ran out of the house and went to her friend's aid.
At the apartment, they find Sierra struggling to deal with the news that her friend is dead.
Yeah, I heard that it was her. I can't believe it.
Well, we were told that she came to see you the night she disappeared.
Yeah, she did come by.
She said that, oh yeah, Lisa was here.
She also said she'd known Lisa for a long time.
They both went for their GED together, and afterwards they became friends. In fact, at one point they were gonna get an apartment together.
But then she'd met her boyfriend, Daquan Wheeler.
She started dating him. She had a child with him, so instead of moving in with Lisa, she moved in with Daquan.
Lisa's family says that you and Daquan have been having issues.
Yeah, that's why Lisa came over on Tuesday.
She admitted that she was fighting with Daquan.
Sierra said that her and Daquan were working different shifts and had been arguing about dividing the responsibilities around their daughter.
So you called her?
Yeah, she's, like a good mediator, talking things out.
Although, according to Sierra, Daquan was in no mood to talk.
And you know what? Another thing about you, man, I just don't understand. Why are you like this?
I'm just trying to take care of our daughter, and you're not trying to be a good dad.
I'm always a good dad. I pay for everything. You do nothing.
What does that mean?
It means everything. What are you talking about?
Hey, it's me.
Why'd you call her?
So she can help.
No, so she can take your side, right? All right, look, man, I can't do this. Y'all have it. Have a good day. I'm done. Bye. Out.
She said that rather than talk things over, Daquan had stormed out.
Oh, gosh, sweetie, what was that all about?
And then everything settled down.
Sierra said since it was so late, she even invited Lisa to spend the night.
But Sierra says Lisa didn't stay long.
She said Lisa had spent the next hour or so on her phone.
She was calling a few friends, texting friends to get money.
I would have given her some, but I'm just as broke as she is.
But then, after an hour of messaging...
Ooh, I got some.
All of a sudden, she said, oh, I got some money.
She say where she was going?
No.
Sierra thought she was going to meet the person who was giving her the money.
But she didn't mention any names.
All right, hey, I gotta go.
She just ran out of the apartment.
Velasquez's friend, Sierra Martinez, has just told NYPD detectives that the 25-year-old had dashed out of her apartment the morning she disappeared.
According to Sierra, Lisa spent the previous hour calling around, texting to see if she could get someone to loan her some cash.
She said, all right, someone's going to give me some money. I'm going to get out of here. And she just left.
And that was the last time you saw her?
Yeah.
She says her boyfriend, Daquan Wheeler, came home a little later.
And then Sierra said, she just spent the night with Daquan.
So now the question is, where did Lisa go? Hoping for answers, the detectives subpoena Lisa's cell phone records.
According to Sierra, she had been calling and texting people looking for money. So it shouldn't be that hard to track down.
Then, while waiting to hear back from Lisa's cell phone provider, the detectives bring in her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Antonio.
They especially wanted to talk to Antonio because Lisa's family said he was controlling.
He was very obsessive with her. He wouldn't let her breathe. So I would tell her he was no good for her.
But does that mean Antonio is her killer?
Antonio, we need to ask you some questions about Lisa.
Is she some kind of trouble?
When they brought him in, they broke the news to him that Lisa was dead.
What?
He was shocked, very upset.
When was the last time you saw her?
Just last weekend.
Contrary to what Lisa's aunt told them, Antonio told the detectives that their on and off relationship was very much currently on.
So you didn't see her Tuesday night, though?
Early Wednesday morning?
No, but I did hear from her.
He said he received a text from her saying that she was on her way, she was in a cab, and then another text right after saying, oh, sorry, wrong number.
Detectives suspect that text might have been meant for Sierra, or possibly the person who agreed to loan her money.
He said he tried to call her that morning, couldn't get in touch, she didn't answer the phone.
That didn't seem unusual to you?
A little.
You didn't want to check up on her?
Not really. I figured she'd get back to me eventually.
He really didn't know her friends or her family to call them to see what's going on with her, so he was sort of just waiting to hear back from her.
However, Antonio says there was one way he could check up on her.
He said they shared an account on a money transfer app. He even let the detectives look at the Cash App on his phone.
They saw that she had gotten money that night from a Corey Drake.
Does that name mean anything to you?
No.
Whoever Corey was, Antonio said he'd sent Lisa $100.
They were asking him, was this sort of common? And he said, look, she never really talked to me about money. She never asked for money, so he didn't really question how she got money. That was the relationship they had.
At least that's what Antonio claims. But the detectives aren't so sure.
The detectives at that point were a little suspicious. Is Antonio jealous that some guy is giving his girlfriend money? Like, it's the motive?
Because according to Lisa's aunt, Antonio had very serious control and trust issues.
But Antonio insists that he's telling the truth.
The detectives again pressed Antonio on whether he had seen Lisa that night.
Antonio said he was home sleeping.
But he also lived alone, so there was no one who could confirm what he was saying.
He really didn't have any alibi.
After talking to Antonio, the detectives subpoena his cell phone data to see if they can verify his whereabouts on the morning of the murder.
They especially wanted to know if he ended up anywhere near Crotona Park.
You are going to look at the boyfriend, okay? You're going to look at somebody that's very close to the victim. You have to investigate that.
However, Antonio isn't the only person they're investigating.
They were also trying to reach out to see who this Corey Drake was and why he was giving Lisa money.
Could it have something to do with her death?
Or is it possible Corey and Antonio are both dead ends?
While the police were trying to figure out who this Corey Drake was who gave Lisa the money, Sierra Martinez walks back into the precinct.
And what she has to say will take the investigation in an entirely different direction.
She tells detectives that she wasn't totally honest.
Told detectives investigating the murder of her friend, Lisa Velasquez, that she wasn't entirely upfront with them the first time they spoke.
She admitted that she was afraid to talk to them the first time.
What were you afraid of?
Daquan?
The detectives sensed they could be on the verge of a breakthrough.
Lisa's family said that she had gone to Sierra and Daquan's apartment on the night she disappeared because Sierra was being abused by Daquan.
Lisa came over.
But in her initial interview with detectives, Sierra had downplayed Daquan's abuse.
All she said was that they had been arguing.
Now Sierra admits that's not the whole truth.
Sierra, does he hit you?
Yes. Especially since the baby's been born.
Sierra said that Lisa encouraged her to leave Daquan.
But you haven't left him?
I couldn't.
Her friend feels trapped. She has a child with this man.
But Lisa never gave up on her.
Lisa was always there for you whenever you needed her.
Lisa told me that if I ever needed her help, I can call her. So that's what I did.
She said that she had called Lisa that night because she was fighting with Daquan.
She was being a good friend, and all that comes into play in terms of how she grew up. And now, in her mind, she's like, I'm not going to ever let this happen again. This is my best friend.
Oh my gosh, sweetie.
And like a true friend, Lisa had come through.
She was very upset, so Lisa came over to help her.
And once again, Sierra says that Daquan had stormed out. Although this time she says he took their little girl with him.
Daquan left with the baby, and it was just her and Lisa in the apartment.
We gotta call the cops. He was so mad when he left. I was afraid he'd do something to her.
Sierra says that the police had come to the apartment.
Police were able to get in touch with Daquan. They called him. He said the child's all right, and they determined that there was no crime committed since he was the father.
And the officers left soon after.
Oh my gosh, sweetie. You gonna be okay?
Mm-hmm. Everything else pretty much happened like I told you guys.
Sierra said she asked Lisa to stay, but Lisa ended up leaving to go get money from someone.
I ended up staying up and watching TV.
And by the time Daquan returned a few hours later, things had calmed down.
Daquan had left their daughter with a friend.
Sierra says she and Daquan spent the next couple of hours talking things through and eventually made up.
But now she has a nagging sense that there is something Daquan is not telling her.
Sierra basically told detectives that, she thought Daquan had something to do with Lisa's murder.
What makes you think that?
Because he left and he was so mad.
All right, Sierra, thanks for coming in. I'll follow up on that.
But while Sierra is suspicious, the detectives aren't so sure.
Sierra might just be trying to get Daquan in trouble.
Still, after talking to Sierra, the detectives bring Daquan in for questioning.
He vehemently denied that he had anything to do with her murder.
Listen, I don't have any idea what Sierra's talking about.
He said after he left the apartment, he went to stay with a friend.
I felt bad about what was going on, so I left the baby with my friend. I came home and, me and Sierra, we worked it out.
When detectives follow up with Daquan's friend, she confirms what he told detectives.
She said Daquan showed up with his child between 3 and 4 a.m., stayed a couple of hours,
And when the detectives tracked down the call Sierra said they made to the police, that checks out too.
My name is Lisa Marie Velasquez. The reason why I am calling is to report a kidnapping.
They called the police because they were afraid about what was going to happen to the little girl.
There was a domestic dispute that got a little physical.
The records also show that wasn't the first domestic violence complaint originating from Sierra and Daquan's address.
Detectives found out that police were called to the couple's apartment on 4 previous occasions.
And as detectives dig into Sierra and Daquan's criminal histories, more red flags go up.
Detectives were surprised to find out that Daquan spent time in jail before.
Daquan was in jail for attempted murder.
And the details of his indictment seem relevant to Lisa's murder.
He tried to stab his intended victim with a sword.
They're thinking someone who a couple of years ago, was swinging a sword, stabbing someone, and now they have a body that's dismembered.
And not just dismembered. According to the autopsy, hacked apart with a large blade.
Convinced that Daquan had some involvement in Lisa's murder and that Sierra knows more than she's letting on, the detectives bring her in for another round of questioning.
But she sticks to her story, saying Lisa left the apartment after someone sent her some money.
She took a phone with her and everything.
But the detectives keep applying pressure.
All we want is the truth.
Okay? 80% of what I told you is true. This is when it gets interesting. And I'm willing to take the steps and procedures to get her justice.
The light bulbs went off. She doesn't want to go down with Daquan.
Eventually, Sierra breaks down.
Sierra said Lisa did get money from a friend, but admitted it was just somebody paying her back, and that she made up the story about her leaving the apartment.
It's late. Just stay.
Sure, I can crash here.
She's like, that's what I'm here for. I'm not going over here.
Sierra said that Lisa had also convinced her to take out an order of protection against Daquan.
She's going to go with me quick the next day.
So, according to Sierra, Lisa had gone to bed and she had taken a shower.
Meanwhile, after leaving their daughter with a friend, Daquan returns to the apartment.
He went and dropped her off and came right back.
And according to Sierra, he'd walked into the bathroom with a hammer.
He comes in, he didn't even say nothing, he whips out the hammer.
Daquan! What are you doing?
I'm screaming.
Sierra said her screams brought Lisa running into the bathroom.
He's trying to kill me! What is it? When she fully turned around, he clubbed her.
Questioned by NYPD detectives investigating Lisa Velasquez's murder, Sierra Martinez has just revealed that her boyfriend, Daquan Wheeler, bludgeoned the 25-year-old to death with a hammer.
On her head? And you hit her with what, the hammer?
One time.
Okay,
One
so what?
good time.
Okay.
And she dropped.
Sierra says she dropped to the floor alongside Lisa and tried to protect her friend.
So I was like, stop. No, stop.
She said, let me call for help, let me take her to the hospital. And Daquan told her to be quiet, he screamed at her, and then he just repeatedly kept hitting her in the head.
I'm hearing it. I'm covering my hands. I'm praying, begging. What you doing, big boy? This is the truth. Eventually, she just stopped moving.
Once Lisa was dead, Sierra says Daquan forced her to help him drag Lisa's body back to the bathroom.
Get up. Hurry up.
Daquan said, if you don't help me, I'll kill you and the baby.
Then, with Lisa in the tub, they cleaned up the blood.
Daquan took all his clothes, all Sierra's clothes, everything that had blood on them, and put it in bags.
He also grabbed all of Lisa's personal things and the hammer and put those in the bags too.
He then left the apartment with Sierra They threw the bags out, and then they went to the store.
They bought more bags and a machete, then brought them back to the apartment.
That's when Daquan started to dismember Lisa's body.
Once again, according to Sierra, it was all Daquan's doing.
What he was doing was inhumane. That's what it was.
Then they loaded everything into Daquan's work van and disposed of the evidence in various spots around the city.
They dumped 2 of the bags in Crotona Park and the rest in another park by the pier.
It's a chilling statement. But is it true?
The detectives locate the rest of Lisa's remains where Sierra indicated.
They also get a warrant to search the couple's apartment.
They were able to find, blood splatter stains throughout the apartment.
Then they bring Daquan in for another round of questioning.
Once in the interrogation room, he denied any involvement in Lisa's murder.
I didn't do anything.
He told police that it was Sierra who did all this.
Lisa told her that I was on a dating app and I wasn't.
He said Sierra became enraged and killed her friend.
He also claimed that Sierra had single-handedly dismembered the body and disposed of it.
So she cleaned before?
She cleaned before I came back to the house.
Came back to the house.
Did you see anything? I didn't see anything.
It was so outrageous and so unbelievable that they knew they had the killer.
The detectives placed Daquan under arrest for murder.
They also arrested Sierra.
But in the end, the prosecutors allow Sierra to plead guilty to conspiracy.
They wanted to have Sierra testify, which is why they gave her the deal that they gave her.
They feel that Daquan had coerced her in helping to dispose of the body.
She was in fear of him. That's why she called Lisa that night.
When Daquan goes on trial in April of 2022, Sierra is the prosecution's key witness.
But when it's the defense's turn, Daquan continues to put all of the blame on Sierra.
That was a joke. Sierra was small. There ain't no way that Sierra will actually do that alone.
That really set me off. I wanted to go over that chair and make him pay for what he did to her.
And in the end, Daquan does pay.
He was convicted of second-degree murder.
He's sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 27 years.
That's hardly enough to those who loved Lisa.
You mean to tell me, so after 27 years, there's a chance you might get out? They say life in prison, where's life?
He's still breathing. He might be getting his behind kicked every now and then, but he's still alive.
And then, adding insult to injury, Sierra receives credit for time served and is released.
When he hit her the first time, okay, you were scared, I get it. But she could have done something.
It's not enough. As far as Sierra, she deserved time. I don't care. You were sick too.
She risked her whole life for you. And then I just chopped this girl up. I'm not satisfied.
Still, for the many people whose lives she touched, Lisa's memory remains an inspiration.
In her short life, she was trying to make a difference. She didn't give up, trying to better herself and better the people around her.
Every day she's thought of, I want people to remember her as a genuine, good sweetheart.
She was fun-loving, nurturing. Oh, God, I miss her so much. I know if she was here, she'd be smacking me in my head. Titi, suck it up and, let's get it going. I truly miss her.
The wind blowing off Lake Michigan on a late October night in 2003 did not just carry the bite of approaching winter. It carried a deep, suffocating sense of dread that would lock a South Side Chicago neighborhood in a state of silent terror for over 2 decades. It was exactly 11:42 p.m. when the neon sign of a local tavern on 55th Street flickered and died, leaving a narrow, garbage-strewn alley in near total darkness. Minutes later, a passing postal worker, finishing an exhausting double shift, cut through the passage to bypass the freezing rain, only to freeze in his tracks as his flashlight beam caught a shape slumped against a rusted steel fire escape. It was 19-year-old university student Clara Hughes, her coat still zipped, her leather backpack untouched, but her life violently taken in a manner that defied the typical violence of the city's streets. There was no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds on her hands, and not a single drop of blood on her clothing despite a fatal, clean laceration to her neck that had been executed with the cold precision of a surgical instrument. Clara had been killed elsewhere, meticulously cleaned of all trace evidence, and placed in the alleyway like a macabre mannequin waiting to be found by the first light of dawn. The initial response from the Chicago Police Department was swift and massive, with blue and red strobe lights reflecting off the wet brick walls, casting long, distorted shadows across a crime scene that would haunt the department for decades. Clara was the daughter of a prominent local defense attorney, and the pressure to deliver a suspect was immediate, heavy, and unforgiving. Yet, as the detectives combed through the wet gravel, they realized the killer had left absolutely nothing behind. No fibers, no foreign fingerprints, and no footprints in the mud. It was as if a ghost had dropped Clara from the sky and vanished into the freezing lake breeze. The only piece of physical evidence was a bizarre, tattered postcard from 1950 tucked into Clara's front pocket, depicting a panoramic view of the old Chicago Union Station, with a single, chilling sentence scrawled in faded blue ink on the back. The train is always on time, but the passengers never arrive. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation hit a brick wall of absolute silence, the promising leads evaporating into the cold Chicago air like steam from a manhole cover. Detectives interviewed Clara's classmates, her neighbors, and the patrons of the tavern, but everyone had an ironclad alibi, secured by the brutal autumn weather that had kept the neighborhood indoors. The phone logs yielded nothing. Her personal journals painted a picture of an ordinary, dedicated student with no enemies and no dangerous secrets. The case began to cool, slipping from the front pages of the Chicago Tribune to the dusty, yellowed folders of the cold case basement at Area Central Headquarters, while the mysterious postcard sat in an envelope in the evidence vault, its ink fading as the years bled into decades. For 23 years, that silence held firm, a permanent scar on the community of Hyde Park and a haunting failure for the retired detectives who had walked the wet bricks of that alley in 2003. Clara Hughes became a ghost of the past, a tragic statistic mentioned only during annual true crime roundups or in the quiet, grief-stricken living room of her surviving family. The world moved on, transitioning from the analog age of magnetic tape and paper files to the hyper-connected digital landscape of the 2020s, but Clara's file remained frozen, untouched, and seemingly unsolvable. But a secret does not stay buried forever when the power of modern digital media is unleashed upon the mysteries of the past. In early 2026, an independent investigative journalist named Liam Vance, host of the viral true crime podcast The Dead Files of the Windy City, decided to pull Clara Hughes' case from the archives. Vance was not interested in official police theories or the sanitized press releases of the early 2000s. He wanted to look at the investigation with a modern, investigative lens, using his massive listener base to crowdsource information that the original detectives had missed. Armed with a microphone, a digital audio workstation, and an insatiable desire for the truth, Vance began a weekly broadcast that would systematically dismantle a 23-year-old cover-up and set off a chain of events culminating in a shocking midnight arrest. The digital signal of the Dead Files of the Windy City did not just transmit through headphones. It cut through the decades-old silence of Chicago's South Side like a high-voltage current. When Liam Vance released the first episode of his investigative podcast in February 2026, he wasn't expecting an immediate breakthrough. He was prepared for the long, tedious work of cold case journalism, the unreturned phone calls, the redacted FOIA requests, and the polite deflections from retired Area Central detectives who wanted the ghosts of 2003 to remain undisturbed in the basement archives. But Clara Hughes was not just another name on a docket. To the residents of Hyde Park, her unsolved murder was a permanent, localized trauma, a chilling reminder that a predator had walked their streets, executed a brilliant young woman with surgical precision, and slipped away into the freezing lake breeze without leaving a single footprint. Vance's approach was entirely different from the rigid, bureaucratic methods of the original 2003 task force. He did not sit in a precinct room waiting for informants to call. He brought the crime scene directly to his listeners. In his makeshift studio in a converted brick warehouse near the Fulton Market District, surrounded by high-resolution monitors displaying maps of the 55th Street alleyway, Vance analyzed the case with a clinical, Don Dapp, rapid-fire delivery. He stripped away the sensationalized media narratives of the early 2000s and focused on the physical geometry of the crime scene. He wanted his audience to feel the biting, wet cold of October 24, 2003. He wanted them to hear the low hum of the elevated trains passing in the distance, and to understand the absolute impossibility of what the police had found. The focus of the podcast's third episode was the vintage 1950 postcard of Union Station. The original detectives had treated it as a bizarre, random calling card left by a transient or a mentally unstable drifter. They had run the handwriting through local databases, searched the National Registry of Postcard Collectors, and eventually logged it into an evidence envelope where it sat for 23 years. But Vance did not look at the postcard as a random artifact. He brought in high-definition digital imaging specialists to scan the card at ultra-high resolutions, searching for microscopic details that the analog technology of 2003 had missed. The results, broadcasted live to over 2 million listeners, were staggering. Under 10,000 times magnification, the blue ink used to write the chilling sentence, "The train is always on time, but the passengers never arrive," revealed microscopic characteristics of a highly specific, obsolete writing instrument, a vintage 1940s fountain pen using iron gall ink. This wasn't the pen of a drifter or a random street criminal. Iron gall ink was a specialized, acidic fluid that darkened over time, highly favored by registrars, archival historians, and forensic examiners for its permanent, non-fading qualities. But the real breakthrough lay not in the ink, but in the paper fibers of the postcard itself. Tucked into the deep, microscopic crevices of the cardboard backing, trapped beneath the dried ink, the imaging team discovered a tiny, preserved speck of organic material. It was a microscopic fleck of industrial coal dust, mixed with a specific, high-grade lubricating grease used exclusively in the maintenance of heavy steam locomotive engines from the mid-20th century. The postcard had not been kept in a box of collectibles or a dusty attic. It had been stored for a very long time in an environment saturated with vintage railway mechanics. Think about the geography of Chicago in 2003. Vance's voice boomed through the speakers of millions of devices, his delivery fast-paced, cinematic, and thick with tension. "We are a city built on steel rails." The South Side was once the beating heart of the American railroad network, a sprawling labyrinth of active yards, maintenance shops, and abandoned terminals. The killer didn't just find this postcard at a flea market. He lived in the soot. He breathed the grease. The postcard wasn't just a threat. It was an autobiography. Within 12 hours of the episode's release, the podcast's secure tip line exploded. Thousands of listeners began mapping the old rail lines of the South Side, digging through historical registries of railroad workers and cross-referencing names with the original 2003 resident lists of Hyde Park. But among the deluge of fan theories and digital noise, a single, anonymous voicemail arrived at 3:14 a.m. that changed the trajectory of the entire investigation. The caller's voice was heavily distorted, altered by a digital modulator that stripped away all age and gender characteristics, leaving only a flat, robotic hiss. But the details they provided were so precise, so intimate, that Vance's breath caught in his throat as he listened to the audio file in his quiet studio. "You're looking at the wrong yards, Liam," the modulated voice whispered through the static. "You're looking at the commercial lines. You need to look at the private spurs." In 2003, there was a small, decommissioned maintenance depot tucked behind the old concrete silos near 61st and Blackstone. It wasn't on the official city maps because it belonged to a private logistics firm that went bankrupt in the late 90s. But the buildings weren't empty. A man lived there. a man who kept a collection of old Union Pacific ledger books, vintage tools, and a cabinet full of fountain pens. He knew Clara. He watched her walk home from the university library every night, and he had a key to the alley gate. The tip was a direct, shocking arrow aimed at the heart of the mystery. Vance did not call the police. He knew that if he ran this information up the traditional law enforcement channels, the bureaucracy would grind it to a halt before anyone could secure a search warrant. He needed to verify the location himself. He grabbed his digital field recorder, a high-powered tactical flashlight, and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night, driving south toward the abandoned industrial corridors of Woodlawn. The neighborhood was silent, locked in the damp, heavy chill of a late winter freeze. As Vance navigated his vehicle through the empty, potholed streets near 61st and Blackstone, the towering, rusted shapes of old concrete grain silos emerged from the mist like ancient, forgotten monuments to the city's industrial past. He parked 2 blocks away, cutting his headlights, and proceeded on foot, his boots crunching softly on the frozen gravel of an abandoned rail spur. The depot was a decaying, single-story brick structure, its windows boarded up with rotted plywood, its sheet metal roof partially collapsed under the weight of decades of winter snow. It was surrounded by a high, chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire, but the lock on the main gate had been cut long ago, replaced by a simple, weathered wire twist. Vance slipped through the gap, his flashlight beam cutting through the dense fog, illuminating the rusted tracks that ran directly into the interior of the building through a pair of massive, wooden carriage doors. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, rotted timber, and the lingering, metallic tang of industrial grease, the exact olfactory signature described by the forensic imaging team. As Vance moved deeper into the cavernous workspace, his light swept over the skeletal remains of old steam machinery, rusted iron gears, and piles of discarded coal dust that had settled on the floor like black sand. This was the environment where the Union Station postcard had been preserved, a silent, frozen vault of Chicago's forgotten labor. But as Vance reached the rear of the depot, where a small office space sat behind a shattered glass partition, his flashlight caught something that made his heart hammer against his ribs. Resting on the wooden floor, directly beneath a rusted metal desk, was a small, heavy iron lockbox. The lid was open, its interior empty except for a single, yellowed newspaper clipping from October 25, 2003, the morning after Clara Hughes was found dead in the Hyde Park alleyway. Written across the top of the clipping, in the exact, dark blue iron gall ink found on the postcard, was a single, handwritten date, October 24, 2003. Beneath it, a second line of text had been scrawled in the same precise, architectural hand. The passenger has arrived. The train has left the station. Vance stood frozen in the dark, the beam of his flashlight shaking slightly as he stared at the handwriting. He wasn't just looking at a crime scene. He was looking at the physical footprint of a killer who had lived in this brick vault, watching his victim from the shadows of the rails, keeping a record of his execution like a trophy. The anonymous tip had been flawless. The ghost of 2003 had a physical address, and the hunt was about to transition from a digital investigation into a high-stakes midnight trap. Vance stepped out of the office, his fingers instantly dialing the secure number for Area Central Homicide. He knew he had enough to force their hand. The digital crowdsourcing of the dead files had cracked the lock on a 23-year-old cold case, and the midnight arrest of Chicago's most elusive predator was finally, terrifyingly within reach. Part 3. The digital recording deck in Liam Vance's studio captured the frantic typing of a man running out of night. By 4:12 a.m., less than an hour after retrieving the newspaper clipping from the abandoned Blackstone depot, Vance had compiled the digital image files, the audio files of the modulated tip, and the historical property records into an encrypted high-security drop folder. He did not send it to the general precinct tip line. He knew that if this information fell into the standard bureaucratic routing system of the Chicago Police Department, the suspect would be tipped off by the morning news cycle. He routed the file directly to the personal, encrypted account of Detective Elena Vance, his sister, and a veteran homicide investigator with Area Central Cold Case Unit who had spent her career trying to scrub the stains of 2003 off the department's ledger. When Detective Vance's phone buzzed on her nightstand in her Hyde Park apartment, she was awake within 3 seconds. She didn't need to read the entire file to understand the explosive nature of what her brother had dragged out of the industrial soot of Woodlawn. She looked at the high-resolution scan of the Iron Gull ink writing on the newspaper clipping. The passenger has arrived. The train has left the station. The architectural, precise slants of the lettering were identical to the postcard that had sat in her unit's evidence vault for 23 years. She threw on her tactical jacket, grabbed her service weapon, and was out the door before the ice on her windshield could clear. By 5 a.m., the Area Central Briefing Room was transformed into an active tactical command center. The blinds were drawn tight against the weak, freezing dawn breaking over Lake Michigan, and the monitors were filled with historical census data, railroad employment registries, and property deeds from the late 90s. The logistics firm that had owned the private rail spur near 61st and Blackstone was a defunct entity called Miller Industrial Transport. When the company filed for bankruptcy in 1999, the property had been tied up in probate court for a decade, completely abandoned by city inspectors. But the state tax records revealed a single, terrifying anomaly. Someone had been quietly paying the minimum localized utility fees for the depot's electrical grid up until 3 months prior. The payments had been made in cash, delivered via money orders tracking back to a currency exchange on the city's west side. The name on the original 1999 Miller Industrial Employment Registry was the key that finally turned the lock on the entire conspiracy. The chief mechanical archivist for the private rail line, a man who had lived in a small, renovated apartment space directly above the depot's rear office throughout the 90s, was 62-year-old Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was not a transient, and he was not a drifter. He was a meticulous, highly trained precision machinist who had spent 40 years maintaining legacy steam engines for the Historical Railway Societies of Illinois. He was a master of mechanical restoration, a man whose private workshop was filled with vintage drafting tools, high-carbon steel machining scribes, and an extensive collection of mid-century fountain pens. But the true shockwave hit the briefing room when Detective Vance cross-referenced Pendleton's employment history with a timeline of Clara Hughes's life. In the spring of 2003, months before her death, Clara had been working on a historical thesis documenting the labor exploitation within the early Chicago rail syndicates. Her research logs, recovered from her university desk by the original task force but dismissed as irrelevant, showed that she had visited the private archives of the Blackstone Depot on 3 separate occasions. She had sat across from Arthur Pendleton, interviewing him about the obsolete logistics logs he preserved. She had trusted him, viewing him as a living museum of the city's industrial history, entirely unaware that the old machinist was developing a clinical, possessive obsession with her every movement. "Look at the spatial geography of his route," Detective Vance said, her laser pointer cutting a sharp red line across the tactical display wall. Pendleton didn't just work at the depot. He operated a private vehicle, a 1991 black station wagon that was registered to the logistics firm but never turned over to the bankruptcy liquidators. In October of 2003, that vehicle was logged by a private security camera near the university campus 3 nights a week, always parked in the shadow of the elevated rail lines directly along the path Clara took to her apartment. He wasn't tracking her from a distance, he was engineering a transition. The tactical plan for the midnight intervention began to lock into place with absolute discipline. Arthur Pendleton had moved out of the Blackstone Depot when the city finally boarded the exterior carriage doors in 2012, but he hadn't left the South Side. The digital tracking of his active state identity showed he was currently renting a small, isolated brick bungalow tucked into an industrial corridor near the Calumet River, surrounded by active scrap yards and shipping canals. The location was an operational nightmare, a dead-end avenue bordered by water on 3 sides, offering multiple paths of evasion through the commercial shipping docks if the suspect detected a police presence. The SWAT commander, a veteran named Captain Briggs, stood before the tactical team, his face grim beneath his ballistic helmet. This isn't a standard dynamic entry. Pendleton is a precision machinist. He knows structural integrity, he knows mechanics, and his workshop is filled with industrial tools that can be weaponized in a fraction of a second. We move at exactly 12 a.m. Total light containment.
No sirens, no loudspeakers.
We seal the river perimeter with 2 Marine units from the Coast Guard, and we drop the intercept team directly onto the gravel driveway before he can reach the garage. Liam Vance sat in the back of the command vehicle, his field recorder resting in his lap, the low static of the tactical radios filling the dark interior. He could hear his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs, a frantic, dawn-dap rhythm that matched the ticking of the digital clock on the dashboard. He had started this journey with a microphone and an old case folder, and now he was riding into the freezing Chicago night alongside a heavily armed federal task force, about to witness the violent dismantling of a 23-year-old lie. The convoy of 4 unmarked black utility vehicles rolled silently out of the area's central garage at 11:30 p.m., their headlights extinguished as they carved through the empty, frost-covered streets of the industrial South Side. The temperature had plummeted past zero, turning the puddles along the Calumet River into sheets of black ice, a thick, freezing mist rolling off the shipping canals to shroud the scrap yards in a suffocating gray veil. The environment was an eerie, absolute reproduction of the October night in 2003, the same biting cold, the same isolation, the same sense of an impending execution. When the convoy reached the perimeter of the Calumet bungalow, the team deployed with mechanical precision. The 2 Marine craft drifted silently into position along the dark water behind the property, their engines cut, their tactical operators scanning the rear veranda with thermal imaging scopes. The house sat in absolute darkness, a low, brick silhouette surrounded by rusted iron gears, old railroad ties, and piles of industrial scrap metal that looked like skeletal monuments in the fog. Thermal readings showed a single, distinct heat signature moving slowly within the basement workshop. Arthur Pendleton was awake, standing over a lathe, entirely unaware that the digital ghosts of his past had finally tracked him to the river's edge. Detective Elena Vance stepped out of the lead vehicle, her hand gripping the butt of her service weapon, her eyes fixed on the basement window where a faint, amber light flickered through the rusted security bars. She signaled to Captain Briggs. The breach team moved forward, their boots making no sound on the frozen gravel, their weapons held at the low ready as they prepared to snap the trap shut on the man who had spent 23 years believing the snow had washed away his sins. The tactical silent sweep of the Calumet riverfront was executed with the chilling, mechanical efficiency of a military operation. Under the thick, freezing blanket of the Chicago midnight, the black-clad operators of the SWAT team moved in absolute synchronization. Their boots, capped in dense, sound-dampening vulcanized rubber, left faint, temporary impressions on the frost-dusted gravel of Arthur Pendleton's driveway. To their left, the dark, slow-moving currents of the Calumet River lapped rhythmically against the rotted wooden pilings of an abandoned shipping dock. The 2 Coast Guard interceptor crafts hovered in the black water like predatory fish, their thermal imaging cameras feeding real-time spatial data directly to the tactical helmets of the breach team. Inside the command vehicle parked 200 yards away, Liam Vance held his breath, his fingers white-knuckled as he gripped the edge of the digital monitoring console. Next to him, the radio dispatcher wore a headset that crackled with the ultra-low, pressurized breathing of the lead operators. On the thermal feed, the lone, orange-white silhouette of Arthur Pendleton remained entirely static, a heat signature hunched over an active piece of machinery in the center of his subterranean basement workshop. He was a man suspended in time, surrounded by the heavy, steel relics of an industrial era he had refused to leave behind. Breach team is in stack position at the rear cellar entrance. Captain Briggs's voice cut through the static, a low, controlled whisper that carried the absolute finality of the law. Biometric door override in 3,
2, 1,
go. The entry was not defined by a loud, explosive breach or the theatrical shattering of wood. Instead, a specialized hydraulic quiet-cut tool bypassed the heavy iron deadbolt of the cellar door in less than 4 seconds. The steel door swung outward with a faint, dry groan of its hinges, and the tactical stack filtered into the basement like a shadow pouring through a cracked container. When the red laser sights of 6 tactical rifles converged on the back of his faded denim work shirt, Arthur Pendleton did not jump. He did not let out a sudden gasp of shock, nor did he reach for the heavy, high-carbon steel machining scribe resting on the workbench beside his right hand. He slowly cut the power toggle of the massive, vintage lathe he had been operating. The deafening, high-pitched whine of the rotating metal spool began to wind down, transitioning into a low, rattling hum that eventually died out, leaving only the sound of the freezing river wind whistling through the rotted wooden joists of the floorboards above. Pendleton slowly raised his hands, his fingers stained black with vintage machine grease and the dark, acidic residue of iron gall ink. He turned around with agonizing slowness, his pale, watery blue eyes squinting against the blinding, high-intensity tactical lights mounted to the rifles. At 62, his face was a map of deep, weathered creases, his silver hair cropped in a severe, military buzz cut that made his sharp, prominent cheekbones look like carved granite. He looked entirely ordinary, a portrait of a forgotten blue-collar craftsman, yet his gaze possessed a chilling, clinical stillness that made Detective Elena Vance's chest tighten as she stepped into the center of the room. "Arthur Pendleton," Elena said, her voice carrying the absolute, unyielding weight of the area's central cold case unit. "You are under arrest pursuant to a federal warrant for the 2003 first-degree murder of Clara Hughes, interstate stalking, and the theft and destruction of forensic evidence." A faint, chilling smile touched the corners of Pendleton's thin lips, a dry, paper-thin movement of a skin that carried no warmth. He looked directly at the gold shield pinned to Elena's tactical vest, then at the camera lens of the digital field recorder Liam held as he stepped into the basement behind his sister. "You've taken a very long time to walk down Blackstone Avenue, Detective," Pendleton said, his voice a dry, rhythmic rattle, like coal sliding down a metal chute. He did not raise his hands higher, keeping them hovered at shoulder height. "I've been watching the streetlights flicker for 23 years. I thought you'd forgotten how to read the maps." "The maps were clean, Arthur," Elena replied, her hand unholstering a pair of heavy, matte black steel handcuffs. "But you left your name written in the soot." As the cuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, the tactical operators moved past him to begin the systematic, room-by-room secure sweep of the basement workshop. It was not a basement. It was a museum of industrial obsession. The concrete walls were lined with heavy, vintage oak cabinets containing thousands of labeled drawers filled with obsolete locomotive components, brass valves, and high-precision drafting compasses. But the true horror lay in the physical geography of the center workbench. Resting on a clean, green felt pad in the middle of his workspace was a collection of high-carbon steel precision scalpels, their blades polished to a mirror finish. Next to them sat a vintage 1940s fountain pen, its gold nib stained with a deep, dark blue ink that had dried into a crust. And beside the pen was a neat, stacked pile of vintage Chicago postcards from the mid-20th century, each one depicting iconic landmarks, the old Navy Pier, the loop under the elevated tracks, and, resting on the very top of the stack, a duplicate of the 1950 Union Station postcard. Liam Vance stepped closer to the workbench, his camera lens capturing the pristine, terrifying reality of the killer's trophy cabinet. "You kept the cards, Arthur," Liam said, his voice tight, the adrenaline of the moment vibrating through his vocal cords. "You kept them because they were your ledger. Every card was a destination you had planned for her." Pendleton turned his head toward the young journalist, his pale blue eyes narrowing as he analyzed the face behind the lens. "The passenger has to have a ticket, young man," he whispered, his voice carrying an unsettling, grandfatherly calm. "If you don't write the destination down, how do you know the train is on time?" "We found the newspaper clipping at the Blackstone Depot, Arthur," Elena said, her voice cutting through his delusional narrative. "The clipping from October 25th, 2003. We know you went back to the alleyway. We know you kept her backpack, her university research files, and the notes she took when she interviewed you about the logistics lines. Where are they?" Pendleton let out a short, dry chuckle that turned into a hollow cough. He gestured with his cuffed hands toward a heavy, steel-plated door built directly into the rear foundation wall of the basement, secured by a massive, industrial-grade mechanical dial lock dating back to the 30s. "I didn't destroy her work, Detective," Pendleton said, his gaze returning to the green felt pad on his workbench. "I preserved it. Clara was a very brilliant girl. She understood the steel. She understood that the city of Chicago was built on the bones of the people who laid the tracks, and she wanted to give them their names back. I simply gave her a permanent place in the history of the line. The files are inside the vault. They've been safe for 23 years." The forensic locksmith stepped forward, his digital scanning tools ready to bypass the vintage mechanical mechanism, but Pendleton did not force the game. He slowly recited a sequence of 6 numbers, October 24th, 03, the exact date of Clara Hughes's murder. When the heavy steel door of the vault clicked open with a deep, metallic resonance, the interior revealed a meticulously organized, climate-controlled archive of a monster. Resting on the steel shelves were the physical remnants of Clara's life, her leather backpack, its straps still stained with the dry mud of the Hyde Park alleyway, her university research folders, their tabs neatly labeled in her own handwriting, and her personal, leather-bound journal, its pages preserved under sheets of archival plastic. But the most devastating piece of evidence inside the vault was a massive, hand-drawn map of the South Side Rail Network, spanning from 1890 to the present day. Pinpointed on the map with small, red steel tacks were 13 distinct locations along the abandoned industrial spurs of the city. Next to each tack, written in the precise, dark blue iron gall ink, was a date, a time, and a single, handwritten female name. Detective Elena Vance felt a cold, paralyzing wave of horror wash over her as she scanned the names on the map. This was not a cold case investigation into a single, tragic homicide from 2003. Arthur Pendleton was not a one-time killer who had slipped away into the lake breeze. He was a highly disciplined, hyper-organized serial predator who had used the abandoned, forgotten arteries of Chicago's railroad system to hunt, execute, and preserve the memories of his victims for over 4 decades. The net had not just closed around the old machinist of the Blackstone Depot, it had unburied a historical registry of death that would send a shockwave of terror through the entire state of Illinois. As the federal convoy prepared to transport Pendleton to the area central holding facility under maximum security, the freezing wind off the Calumet River howled through the scrap yards, a wild, mourning sound that seemed to carry the long-forgotten voices of the girls on the map, finally rescued from the dark vault of the rails. Part 5. The heavy, steel-plated vault door stood wide open, its shadows cutting a dark, geometric void into the damp, concrete-walled basement of the Calumet bungalow. Inside, the red laser beams of the tactical flashlights danced across the organized shelves, illuminating the preserved, tragic remnants of a life stolen 23 years ago. Clara Hughes's leather backpack, her university research folders, and her personal, leather-bound journals sat arranged like artifacts in a private museum of obsession. But it was the massive, hand-drawn map of the South Side Rail Network pinned to the back wall of the vault, dotted with 13 red steel tacks and 13 handwritten female names, that turned the air in the basement into a freezing, suffocating weight. Detective Elena Vance stood motionless before the map, her eyes tracking the dates written in the precise, dark blue iron gall ink. The earliest date went back to the summer of 1981. The most recent was marked in the winter of 2018. Across 4 decades, the city of Chicago had investigated these disappearances as isolated incidents, transient runaways, or tragic victims of the city's broader, chaotic street violence. But the map laid bare a terrifying, systematic truth. The abandoned, rusted veins of the railroad network had been the private hunting ground of a single, invisible predator. Behind her, Arthur Pendleton remained seated in his wooden work chair, his hands secured behind his back by the heavy steel handcuffs. He did not look at the tactical team systematically cataloging his vault. He looked at the green felt pad on his workbench, his face entirely devoid of panic, his breathing slow, rhythmic, and chillingly calm. "You've built a very detailed registry, Arthur," Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that cut through the soft, distant hum of the Calumet River wind. She turned slowly to face him, her hand resting on the butt of her service weapon. 13 names. 13 red tacks. Each one placed exactly along a decommissioned rail spur or an abandoned maintenance terminal. You didn't just hunt them. You mapped them like freight cargo. Pendleton tilted his head back, his pale blue eyes reflecting the harsh glare of the tactical lights with a clinical, detached curiosity. The railroad is a system of absolute discipline, Detective, he whispered, his voice dry and rattling, like coal sliding down a metal chute. Every engine has a designation. Every car has a cargo manifest. If you do not keep the registry, the system falls into chaos. I did not treat them like cargo. I gave them order. I kept them from being forgotten in the weeds. You killed them, Arthur, Liam Vance said, stepping forward, his digital camera recording every micro-movement of the old machinist's face. You took their lives. You locked their memories in a steel box, and you let their families spend decades drowning in the silence you created. That isn't order. That's a slaughterhouse. Pendleton's gaze shifted to Liam, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the young journalist's face with a cold, condescending intensity. You have a very loud voice, young man, but you do not understand the steel. You think the city of Chicago was built by the politicians in their clean suits? It was built by the locomotives. It was built by the coal, the iron, and the men who had the grease deep in their skin. But when the diesel came, they tore down the roundhouses. They abandoned the depots. They left the history of this line to rot in the mud. I didn't let Clara rot. I brought her research to life. I completed her thesis. By slitting her throat in an alley? Elena hissed, her fist clenching. I gave her a transition, Pendleton said, his voice rising slightly, carrying a chilling, absolute self-righteousness. Clara was a brilliant girl, but she was a spectator. She wanted to write about the rails from her warm desk at the university library. She didn't understand that the line demands a physical sacrifice. When she sat across from me at the Blackstone Depot in 2003, she looked at the old ledger books and she saw numbers. I wanted her to feel the weight of the iron. I wanted her to become a permanent passenger on the South Sideline. Elena signaled to the forensic technicians waiting at the top of the cellar stairs. Get the mobile lab down here. I want every square inch of this workshop swept for touch DNA, biological fluids, and trace fiber evidence. And get the county prosecutor on the line. We're going to need a federal emergency order to seal this entire property as an active serial homicide scene. As the technicians filed into the basement with their silver cases and blue light scanners, Elena and Liam guided Pendleton up the narrow wooden steps and out into the biting, sub-zero chill of the Chicago night. The convoy of unmarked black utility vehicles sat idling in the gravel driveway, their exhaust plumes rising into the freezing mist like white smoke. The two Coast Guard Marine craft remained positioned in the dark water of the Calumet River, their spotlights cutting through the fog to illuminate the rusted industrial scrap yards on the opposite bank. The transition from the Calumet bungalow to the area central holding facility was carried out in absolute, pressurized silence. Pendleton sat in the rear of the lead vehicle, flanked by two armed SWAT operators, his eyes fixed on the passing industrial landmarks of the South Side, the rusted drawbridges, the abandoned coal silos, and the endless, black webs of the elevated tracks. He looked like a traveler taking a familiar journey, entirely unbothered by the fact that he was riding toward his own execution. By 2:15 a.m., the area central briefing room was a hive of frantic, high-stakes activity. On the main wall, the old 1989 rail map had been replaced by a digital, high-resolution scan of the map recovered from Pendleton's vault. The names and dates were being cross-referenced with the National Missing Persons Database, and with every hit, a collective, heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah Jenkins. August 12, 1981. Michelle Carter. June 4, 1987. Rebecca Vance. November 18, 1992. Clara Hughes. October 24, 2003. The names stretched across 40 years of unsolved tragedies, each one matching a cold case file that had been buried in the basement archives of the Chicago Police Department. The profiles were identical. Young, ambitious women, many of them students or local researchers, who had vanished while navigating the industrial South Side, only for their bodies to be recovered weeks later in abandoned, high-precision structural environments near the rails. Liam Vance stood in the corner of the room, his field recorder resting on his desk, his mind racing as he stared at the digital display. The podcast had started as an attempt to find justice for a single victim, but the crowdsourced digital dragnet had unburied an absolute monster. Arthur Pendleton had lived in the shadows of the city's industrial decay, using his knowledge of the abandoned railway tunnels and private spurs to move through the city like a ghost, leaving no trace of his passage except for the vintage postcards he left in his victims' pockets. Elena Vance stepped into the room, her face pale, holding a thin, red-labeled folder. The state attorney's office has officially approved the multi-jurisdictional indictment, Marcus, she said, her voice tight with exhaustion and adrenaline. We're charging him with 13 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and the concealment of homicidal deaths. There is no bail on the table. But we have a major problem. What is it? Liam asked. The vintage silver whistle we found on his workbench, Elena explained, opening the folder to reveal a close-up photograph of the metal object. Our toolmark examiners just ran a comparative analysis on the carved word silence on the side of the whistle. The engraving tool used to carve that word is an absolute, mechanical match for the high-carbon scribe we seized from his bench tonight. But the whistle itself isn't a replica. It's an original 1950s Chicago Police Department transit whistle, the exact model carried by the security division of the Illinois Central Railroad during the mid-century strike. She looked at Liam, her eyes wide with a cold, devastating realization. Arthur Pendleton didn't steal that whistle from an archive, Liam. It was issued to his father, Thomas Pendleton, who was the chief of security for the private rail lines in the 1950s. The violence didn't start with Arthur in 1981. It started a generation before. The Blackstone Depot wasn't just his workshop. It was a hereditary slaughterhouse. The revelation sent a wave of physical nausea through Liam's chest. The network of death was deeper, older, and far more complex than anything they had imagined. The midnight arrest of Arthur Pendleton was not the end of the journey. It was merely the opening of a new, terrifying chapter that would force the city of Chicago to confront the dark, bloody foundations of the rails that built it. The trap had closed on the old machinist, but the echoes of the silence he had carved into his victims' lives would vibrate through the federal courthouses and the streets of the South Side for years to come. The fluorescent lights of the area's central holding facility buzzed with a flat, clinical drone that seemed to vibrate through the yellowed cinderblock walls. Inside Interrogation Room 4, the air was cold, smelling of ozone, industrial floor cleaner, and the stale, damp scent of Calumet River mist clinging to Arthur Pendleton's denim work shirt. He sat in the center of the room, his hands cuffed behind his back, his body perfectly still, almost matching the gray concrete of his surroundings. Across the steel table, Detective Elena Vance did not sit. She stood by the observation window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching the micro-movements of the old machinist's eyes. On the metal table between them lay the red-labeled folder, open to the photograph of the vintage transit whistle, alongside the high-resolution digital map displaying the 13 red tacks marking the graves of Chicago's forgotten daughters. We ran the service records of your father, Thomas Pendleton, Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, quiet register that carried the sharp, icy edge of a scalpel. Chief of Security for the Illinois Central Railroad from 1952 to 1974. A man who was officially commended 3 times for clearing the private rail yards of transients, union organizers, and labor saboteurs. But his private logs tell a very different story, Arthur. Your father didn't just clear the yards. He policed them with an iron fist, and he taught you that the tracks belonged to your family. He taught you that anyone who stepped onto the ballast without a ticket was a liability to be neutralized. Pendleton slowly raised his head, his pale blue eyes reflecting the harsh overhead light with a cold, glassy intensity. A faint, dry rattle of a chuckle shook his throat, the sound of metal shavings grinding in a gears. My father understood the architecture of the city, Detective, Pendleton whispered, his voice carrying that same unsettling, grandfatherly calm that made the hairs on Elena's arms stand up. He knew that Chicago was not a place of laws. It was a place of vectors. If the freight did not move, the city died. If the steel cracked, the nation stopped. The union organizers, the drifters, the people who wanted to disrupt the line, they were like rust on a pristine locomotive. You do not negotiate with rust. You do not put it on trial. You scrape it off, you grease the metal, and you keep the engine moving forward. And the young women? Liam Vance's voice cut through the hum of the recording decks from the corner of the room. He held the digital video camera steady, its red recording light blinking in the low light like a miniature, rhythmic heartbeat. What about Sarah Jenkins in 1981? She wasn't a union organizer. She was a 22-year-old secretary who was walking home from the 47th Street station. Did she threaten your precious vectors? Pendleton turned his gaze slowly toward Liam, his eyes narrowing into two slivers of cold, calculating slate. Sarah Jenkins was reckless, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any human resonance. She did not walk with her eyes on the path. She walked with her head in the clouds, listening to a portable tape player, entirely oblivious to the machinery of the line around her. She stepped off the platform and entered the private maintenance corridor near the old coal chutes. She was walking on my father's gravel. She was walking in the dark, where only the engineers belonged. So you followed her, Elena pressed, leaning over the table, forcing him to look at the photo of the first red tack. You used your father's transit key to bypass the security gate. You cornered her in the shadow of the old timber trestles, and you used a high-carbon machining scribe to sever her spinal cord. I gave her a destination, detective. Pendleton corrected her, his voice rising slightly, carrying a chilling, absolute self-righteousness. She was wandering in the dark without a ticket. I stopped her from falling into the machinery. I placed her in the old utility locker, wrapped her in the clean wool of a railway blanket, and I wrote her name in the log. I kept her safe from the weather. I gave her order. That is not murder. That is maintenance. Elena felt a cold wave of nausea hit her chest. The absolute, psychopathic detachment of the old man was like staring into a deep, abandoned mine shaft. He did not view his victims as human beings with families, dreams, and futures. To Arthur Pendleton, they were simply anomalies in his system, imperfections on his tracks that had to be systematically cleared, catalogued, and locked away in his subterranean vault to maintain the pristine, mechanical order of his father's empire. You didn't just keep them in the log, Arthur, Liam said, his hand tightening on the camera grip. You kept their belongings. Clara's backpack, Sarah's watch, Michelle Carter's graduation ring. You kept them in that zinc-lined locker like trophies. They were not trophies, Pendleton hissed, his jaw tightening, his gray eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous heat that made the metal chains of his handcuffs rattle sharply against the back of his chair. They were the registry files. If you do not keep the physical files, how do you verify the delivery? If the inspector comes to the Blackstone Depot, how do you prove the line is clear? My father kept his files in the old 3rd Precinct locker. I kept mine in the vault. We preserved the history that the city council wanted to pretend never existed. Elena turned back to the digital display, her fingers quickly bringing up a secondary file that had been flagged by the forensic team during the early morning processing of the Calumet workshop. Let's talk about the summer of 1992, Elena said, her voice cutting through his defensive posture like an iron spike. The 3rd tack on your map, Rebecca Vance. She was an archivist for the Chicago Historical Society. She had spent 6 months cataloging the legacy files of the Illinois Central Railroad, specifically looking at the Security Division's dispatch logs from the 50s, the logs your father, Thomas Pendleton, had signed off on. She had flagged 23 unexplained disappearances of young labor workers during the 1958 strike. She was going to present her findings to the county prosecutor on a Monday morning. She never made it to the office. She tapped the screen, displaying a photograph of a dusty, leather-bound logistics ledger recovered from the bottom shelf of Pendleton's vault. The page was dated November 18, 1992, written in the same dark blue iron gall ink. She found your father's ledger, didn't she, Arthur? Elena asked, her eyes locking onto his face. She found the record of the people your father had cleared from the yards. She knew that the security division was operating a private death squad for the logistics firms. And she had linked the signatures on those orders directly to your family. You didn't kill her because she stepped onto your gravel. You killed her to protect the family business. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The rhythmic, soft hum of the ventilation system seemed to amplify, filling the small interrogation room like the roar of a distant freight train passing through an empty tunnel. Arthur Pendleton slowly closed his eyes, his head bowing slightly toward his cuffed hands. For a long, agonizing second, the unyielding, statuesque posture of the machinist seemed to fracture, his thin lips trembling as he whispered a sequence of words that were barely audible over the low hum of the recording decks. "The line must remain clear," he muttered, his voice a dry, rattling hiss. "My father spent 30 years of his life in the soot so that people like you could walk these avenues without looking behind you. He did the dirty work in the dark. He kept the engines running. If Rebecca Vance had published those logs, the entire history of the Illinois Central would have been dragged into the mud. The lawsuits, the scandals, the federal investigations, it would have torn the South Side apart. I did what my father would have done. I met her at the historical library. I told her I had the original logs from the Blackstone Depot. I brought her to the vault, and I closed the ledger." Reyes stood in the observation room behind the glass, his hands resting on the console, his eyes fixed on the television monitor displaying the live feed of the interrogation. He could hear the physical vibration of Pendleton's voice, a gravelly, mechanical tone that carried the heavy, generational rot of a family that had policed the city's veins with blood. The net had not just closed around a serial killer, it had unburied a 40-year institutional conspiracy that touched the very foundations of Chicago's industrial history. As the clock on the wall clicked toward 3 a.m., the first pale, icy blue rays of the morning sun began to filter through the security glass of the outer corridor, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete floor. The cold case of Clara Hughes was officially solved. The machinist of Calumet was trapped in the cage of his own making, and the long, freezing silence of the South Side rails was finally, violently coming to an end. The confession of the Rebecca Vance execution in 1992 did not just linger in the cold air of Interrogation Room 4. It acted as a chemical catalyst, instantly dissolving the remaining legal insulation that had protected the Pendleton bloodline for over half a century. Outside the double-paned observation mirror, the Area Central Command Hub was transformed into a high-velocity digital clearinghouse. Telemetry feeds from the state archives, federal historical property databases, and old probate records from the Cook County Clerk's office were being routed directly into the main matrix. The red and blue tactical icons indicating active search teams across the South Side were flashing with relentless frequency, signaling that the digital Dragnet Vance's podcast had unleashed was now a runaway locomotive of federal judicial execution. Detective Elena Vance stood at the head of the steel table, her knuckles pressed firmly against the cold metal surface, her shadow cast long and sharp across the digital printout of the 13 victims. She didn't look at the high-resolution photographs of the vintage silver transit whistle or the microscopic scans of the iron gall ink. Her gaze was locked onto Arthur Pendleton's silver, military-cropped head. The old machinist had returned to his statuesque state of absolute immobility, his cuffed hands resting heavy against the back of the wooden chair, his breathing settling back into that clinical, rhythmic cycle that matched the mechanical drone of the ventilation system. Your father's ledger didn't stop with the Illinois Central Railroad strike of 1958, Arthur, Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, burning register that cut through the low-frequency hum of the room like an industrial saw blade. When the logistics firms consolidated into the regional transit authorities in the mid-70s, Thomas Pendleton didn't retire. He was brought on as a private security consultant for the municipal development syndicates that were buying up the rail corridors along the Calumet shipping canals. He wasn't just clearing the yards of transients anymore. He was clearing the land of anyone who stood in the way of the corporate property transfers. And you were his shadow apprentice. Pendleton slowly raised his chin, the harsh overhead fluorescent tubes reflecting off his weathered, deeply lined features like light hitting cracked granite. A faint, dry rattle emerged from his chest, a mocking sound that carried the absolute, unyielding arrogance of a man who believed his metrics were entirely beyond the comprehension of the room. "A city is not a collection of buildings, Detective," Pendleton whispered, his voice dry and flat, carrying the mechanical cadence of a ticker tape machine. "It is a system of clearance. If the right-of-way is blocked by sentimentalities, the modern world stalls." The development syndicates understood that. My father understood that. When the old tracks were decommissioned in the 70s, the city council wanted to turn those corridors into public parks and residential avenues. They wanted to forget the grease. They wanted to forget the labor. They wanted to pretend that the wealth of Chicago grew out of the dirt like grass. We made sure the property remained secure. We made sure the land stayed silent. By executing anyone who looked too closely at the titles, Liam Vance said, stepping forward from the corner of the room, his hand rock steady on the grip of the digital camera. The small red recording light blinked rhythmically, casting a faint, crimson pulse across the concrete wall. "Let's talk about the fifth tack on your map. Let's talk about the summer of 1999. Let's talk about Detective Marcus Reyes's predecessor, Homicide Lieutenant David Miller." The mention of the name David Miller caused a sudden, sharp fracture in Pendleton's clinical armor. His pale blue eyes narrowed to two razor-thin slivers of frozen slate, his cuffed hands tightening violently against each other until the heavy steel links of the handcuffs let out a single, sharp clack against the metal backing of the chair. In July of 1999, David Miller had been a young, relentless internal affairs investigator who had quietly begun pulling the missing persons archives from the old 3rd Precinct. He had noticed a statistical anomaly that the department's command staff had systematically ignored for a decade, a cluster of 7 young women who had vanished within a 3-block radius of the active rail spurs near 55th Street, all of them disappearing during the late shift hours when the local logistics lines were transferring freight. Miller had kept his investigative notes on a sequence of yellow legal pads, hiding them inside a locked filing cabinet in his home study in Hyde Park. He never got the chance to present his findings to the state attorney. On a humid summer night, he was found dead in his closed garage, his vehicle running, the county coroner quickly ruling it a tragic suicide brought on by personal depression and the stress of his division duties. David Miller was a weak man, Pendleton said, his voice dropping to an icy, dangerous register that sent a sudden thrill of pure adrenaline down Liam's spine. He had a mind for paperwork, but he had no stomach for the structure. He began pulling down files that did not belong to his division. He went into the old 3rd Precinct basement and broke the seal on my father's operational registries. He was going to drag 40 years of secure clearance into the public press. He didn't understand that if you compromise the stability of the transport lines, the entire municipal economy takes a hit. The syndicates wouldn't have built the new commercial terminals if they thought their property titles were tainted by historical inquiries. "So you went to his house," Elena said, leaning down until her face was inches from the old machinists. "You used your father's legacy master keys to bypass his front door while his family was out of town. You cornered him in his study. You paralyzed him using a high-carbon steel tool from your workshop, and you dragged his body into the driver's seat of his own car. You turned the ignition key, you locked the garage door from the outside, and you let the carbon monoxide do the work of a professional executioner." "I protected the line, Detective," Pendleton barked, a flash of absolute, generational authority breaking through his ordinary, craftsman persona. Miller was a soldier firing his weapon into his own trench. You do not court-martial a man who is actively trying to blow up the command post. You neutralize him. You clear the vector. The medical examiner who signed the suicide certificate understood the macroeconomics of this city. He knew that an accidental casualty was the only thing standing between the department and a federal grand jury investigation that would have paralyzed every precinct from the Loop to the state line. "But you didn't destroy his notes, did you, Arthur?" Liam Vance's voice cut through the self-righteous justification like a physical blow. He reached into his tactical pack and pulled out a high-resolution color printout of the second chest recovered from the Calumet vault. "The forensic team just finished scanning the contents of the steel utility trunk we pulled from beneath your garage concrete. Tucked into the bottom layer, wrapped in an oil-stained security uniform shirt from 1974, were the original yellow legal pads David Miller used to map your family's crimes. You kept them. You kept them as your ultimate insurance policy against the very developers who paid your father's protection fees. Pendleton's jaw tightened, the deep muscles along his weathered neck flaring as he looked at the image of the yellow paper. The proud, unyielding posture that had defined his 40-year run as the ghost of the rails was beginning to show its first terminal fractures. The system he had relied on, the institutional fear, the political convenience, the silent complicity of the old guard, had been completely bypassed by a digital archive and a true crime broadcast that didn't play by the rules of the precinct house. "The notes are old ink on rotted paper, young man," Pendleton whispered, his voice returning to a dry, rattling hiss. "My lawyers will tie your digital scans up in probate court for a decade. You cannot convict a man of capital murder based on the private journals of a dead investigator who took his own life 30 years ago." "We don't need the journals to prove the murder, Arthur," Elena Vance said, her voice steadying into a cold, hard declaration of absolute victory. She tapped her terminal, bringing up a live video feed from the forensic laboratory at Area Central. The mobile lab just finished running the vacuum extraction on the steering wheel cover of David Miller's vehicle, the car we dragged out of your pool house foundation tonight. Trapped inside the microscopic cracks of the leather, preserved for 27 years beneath the concrete layer, they found a pristine sample of touch DNA. It doesn't match David Miller. It doesn't match the paramedics. It is an absolute, flawless match for your father, Thomas Pendleton. He wasn't just directing you from the depot, Arthur. He held the steering wheel while you locked the garage door. The silence that followed was absolute, a dead, hollow space where the past had finally, violently collided with the present under the harsh, unblinking glare of the modern world. The old machinist of Calumet sat entirely exposed, the hereditary shadow of his family's slaughterhouse laid bare for the grand juries, the media, and the millions of listeners who were currently downloading the emergency update of the dead files of the Windy City. The trap had closed, the concrete had been cut, and the final, devastating collapse of the South Side Rail Syndicate was officially underway. The static hiss of the digital recording decks in the observation room of Area Central Homicide seemed to grow louder, filling the dead space between the ticks of the wall clock with a cold, electrical vibration. Outside, the freezing rain had transitioned into a heavy, wet sleet that pelted against the security glass, threatening to freeze the city's elevated tracks into silent, steel ribbons. But inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was a pressurized vault. The revelation of Thomas Pendleton's touch DNA on the steering wheel of David Miller's rusted vehicle had not just broken the defense of the old machinist, it had completely torn the mask off a half-century of systematic municipal execution. Detective Elena Vance did not lean back. She kept her palms flat on the steel table, her body angled forward like a predatory hawk closing in on its target. Her shadow, cast by the buzzing overhead fluorescent tubes, completely swallowed the green felt pad where the vintage silver transit whistle lay. Across from her, Arthur Pendleton's breathing had changed. The slow, rhythmic, almost mechanical inhalation that had characterized his 23 years of silence was gone, replaced by a shallow, rapid rise and fall of his chest. His pale blue eyes were no longer fixed on his cuffed hands. They were locked onto the high-resolution forensic scan of his father's print, his pupils dilated with a sudden, devastating realization that his family's perfect system had been fatally flawed from the very beginning. "The steering wheel didn't lie, Arthur," Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that carried the absolute, unyielding power of the state. "Your father, Thomas, spent his entire career teaching you how to clear the ballast, how to wipe down the tools, and how to use the abandoned corridors to move through this city like a ghost. But he was an old-school cop. He understood blood, he understood footprints, and he understood how to buy a coroner's signature. What he didn't understand was the invisible trail he was leaving behind. He didn't know that the oils from his skin, trapped beneath the leather wrap of David Miller's steering wheel, would wait 27 years in a concrete-sealed tomb just to pull his son into a federal courtroom. Pendleton's jaw worked silently, the deep, weathered muscles along his neck flaring as he struggled to maintain his clinical composure. He slowly raised his cuffed hands, the heavy steel links letting out a sharp, metallic rattle against the table. "My father was a master of the yard, detective," he whispered, his voice dry, carrying the raspy, scratching texture of dry sand sliding down a concrete chute. He didn't make mistakes. If his hand was on that wheel, it was because the situation required a physical adjustment. You cannot move a 2-ton vehicle into a closed garage without a driver. You cannot rely on a weak-willed internal affairs investigator to cooperate with his own exit. It was a manual operation. "And you were the one who held the door," Liam Vance said, stepping forward from the dark corner of the room, his hand rock steady on the grip of the high-definition video camera. The small, red recording light blinked in the low light, a rhythmic, crimson pulse that seemed to count down the seconds of Pendleton's freedom. "You were 35 years old in 1999, Arthur. You were at the absolute peak of your physical and mechanical strength. Your father was retired, but he was still the architect. He sat in the passenger seat, directing the placement of the vehicle, while you carried David Miller's paralyzed body into the exhaust stream." David Miller was a saboteur, Pendleton hissed, his eyes flashing with a sudden, wild intensity that shattered his grandfatherly persona, revealing the cold, clinical monster that had lived in the shadows of the Blackstone Depot. He was not a detective. A detective protects the stability of the city. A detective understands that some files are meant to remain locked in the basement to ensure the trains run on time. Miller wanted to open the vault. He wanted to show the federal prosecutors the transaction logs between the Illinois Central Security Division and the developers who built the commercial corridors along the Calumet River. If those logs had been published, the entire industrial rebirth of the South Side would have been halted. The steel mills were closing, the neighborhoods were starving, and those development contracts were the only thing keeping the city's heart beating. "I did not kill him for personal gain. I neutralized him to protect the future of the line." "You did it to protect your father's offshore pension, Arthur," Elena countered, her voice cutting through his self-righteous narrative like an iron spike. She reached into her folder and pulled out a secondary financial analysis sheet that had been decrypted from the legacy files of the Miller Industrial Transport firm. The developers weren't just funding the security division. They were wiring $75,000 a year directly to a shell company in the Cayman Islands registered under your father's name. It was a permanent kickback for ensuring that the land along the shipping canals was cleared of obstacles. And those obstacles weren't just union organizers. They were the young women who happened to walk past your security gates at the wrong hour. She tapped the digital display, bringing up the 7th name on the map recovered from the Calumet Vault, Michelle Carter. June 4th, 1987. "Let's talk about Michelle," Elena said, her voice dropping to a cold, clinical cadence. 21 years old. An engineering student at the Illinois Institute of Technology. She was working on a summer research project mapping the structural integrity of the abandoned subterranean freight tunnels beneath the Chicago Loop, the old Chicago Tunnel Company's narrow-gauge network. She was mapping the very corridors your father's security team used to move cargo without triggering the city's transit logs. "She found your storage vaults, didn't she, Arthur?" The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The low-frequency hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to amplify, filling the small interrogation room like the roar of a distant freight train passing through an empty tunnel. Arthur Pendleton slowly closed his eyes, his head bowing slightly toward his cuffed hands. For a long, agonizing second, the unyielding, statuesque posture of the machinist seemed to fracture, his thin lips trembling as he whispered a sequence of words that were barely audible over the low hum of the recording decks. "She was wandering in the deep concrete, Detective," Pendleton whispered, his voice a dry, rattling hiss. "The loop tunnels are 40 feet below the streets. They are dark, they are damp, and they are entirely restricted to authorized personnel. She was not supposed to have the blueprints. She was not supposed to be carrying a camera. She went into the abandoned intersection beneath Monroe Street, near the old coal drop, and she found the crates. She found the old brass transit tokens, the vintage uniforms, and the ledger books from the 50s. She was going to show her professor. She was going to bring the city inspectors down into our private line." So you met her in the dark, Liam said, his camera catching the subtle, terrifying shift in the old man's expression as he recounted the execution. You didn't use a vehicle and you didn't use a gun. You knew those tunnels better than anyone in Chicago. You tracked her through the abandoned narrow-gauge lines, using the silence of the concrete to mask your approach. The acoustics in those tunnels are very specific, Pendleton said, his eyes opening, his gaze locked onto the image of Michelle Carter's graduation photo with a detached, clinical appreciation. You can hear footsteps 3 blocks away if you know how to listen. But if you walk on the ties, if you step only on the rotted timber, where the dampness has softened the wood, you make no sound at all. She was standing over a rusted switch box, trying to read the serial numbers with her flashlight, when I stepped out of the lateral drift. She didn't even have time to turn her head. A single, clean insertion of the high-carbon scribe at the base of the skull, right between the first and second cervical vertebrae.
No struggle.
No noise. She fell into the coal dust as gently as a sleeping child. Elena felt a cold wave of physical nausea wash over her chest. The absolute, psychopathic detachment of the old man was like staring into a deep, abandoned mine shaft. To Arthur Pendleton, the murder of a brilliant young woman was not a crime of passion or violence. It was a simple, routine act of industrial maintenance, a necessary clearance of an anomaly that had threatened the pristine, mechanical order of his father's legacy. And then you used the ghost train, Elena said, her voice steadying into a hard, dangerous declaration of victory. The unscheduled, industrial maintenance engine that your father had authorization to operate during the late shift hours. You put her body in a utility car, covered her with a heavy wool railway blanket, and ran the engine all the way down to the Woodlawn Terminal, where you sealed her inside the old concrete coal silo. It was a perfect transit, Pendleton whispered, a faint, chilling smile touching the corners of his thin lips. The city was sleeping. The dispatchers were on our payroll. The signals were all green. We moved through the heart of the city, 40 feet beneath the loop, and not a single soul knew that the passenger was on board. We gave her order, detective. We gave her a permanent place in the structure of the line. The line is dead, Arthur, Elena said, standing up and heading toward the door. The federal excavation team is currently setting up containment tents over the Monroe Street intersection. We've already bypassed the concrete seals on the old coal drop. By sunrise, the forensic teams will have extracted every database, every crate, and every victim you and your father tried to bury in the dark. The podcast has already broadcasted your confession to 3 million people. The old guard can't protect you anymore. The developers are liquidating their assets, the politicians are resigning, and the entire house of cards your father built on the south side is coming down tonight. Reyes stood in the observation room, his hands resting on the control panel, his eyes fixed on the television monitor displaying the live feed of the interrogation. The cold case of 1989 was no longer an isolated tragedy stranded in the snow of Hyde Park. It was the key that had finally unlocked a 40-year history of systemic execution. As the digital clock on the wall clicked toward 5 a.m., the first pale, icy blue rays of the Chicago morning began to filter through the security glass of the outer corridor, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete floor. The trap had closed on the machinist of Calumet. The silence of the rails had been broken, and the final, devastating collapse of the Pendleton Empire was officially, beautifully underway. The blue neon glow of the tactical monitoring panels inside courtroom 402 of the Dirksen Federal Building did not just illuminate the digital files of the Cook County Cold Case database. It cast a sharp, unyielding light on the decaying foundations of Chicago's old guard. By 5:15 a.m., as the freezing sleet outside began to glaze the concrete of the loop in a treacherous sheet of black ice, the city's political machinery was fracturing in real time. The live, emergency broadcast of the dead files of the Windy City had bypassed every traditional gatekeeper of the local press, routing Arthur Pendleton's raw, whispered confession of the subterranean executions directly into the headphones of 3 million citizens. It was a digital shockwave that left the municipal administration completely paralyzed, unable to deploy the usual deflections, bureaucratic delays, or coordinated media denials. The past had finally, violently breached the present, and the excavation of the Monroe Street freight tunnels was about to lay bare the literal skeleton of the system. Detective Elena Vance stood in the observation deck of the Federal Command trailer, parked on the wet, vibrating asphalt of Monroe Street directly above the underground rail drifts. The area had been completely cordoned off by federal marshals, their unmarked utility vans forming a tight, black wall against the curious eyes of early morning commuters. Heavy industrial generators hummed on the flatbeds, sending thick plumes of diesel exhaust into the freezing gray mist, while giant ventilation hoses snaked down into the pavement through an old municipal maintenance shaft. The air smelled of burnt grease, ozone, and the stale, damp scent of 40 feet of subterranean concrete that was currently being forced to exhale its secrets. The ground-penetrating radar just confirmed the second void under the Monroe switchbox, the lead forensic engineer said, his voice muffled by the heavy respirator mask hanging around his neck. He pointed to a high-definition monitor displaying a three-dimensional wireframe model of the tunnel system. The concrete layer surrounding the old coal drop isn't part of the original 1906 construction. It's high-density structural epoxy, poured sometime in the late 80s. There's a cavity inside, roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and completely sealed against moisture. It matches the exact spatial dimensions of the zinc-lined utility lockers Pendleton described. Elena adjusted her tactical earpiece, her gaze locked on the monitor as the digital image of the void slowly rotated in 3 dimensions. How long to breach? We're using diamond-tipped concrete saws to avoid fracturing the interior contents, the engineer replied, his fingers tapping the keyboard to adjust the thermal sensors. The dust is heavy down there, and the air is highly toxic with legacy coal residue. We should have the seal broken in less than 20 minutes. But Elena, the sensors are flagging more than one signature in that drift. The void doesn't just contain one locker. There are 3 distinct cavities cast into the same concrete block. The revelation went through the command trailer like a physical drop in temperature. Arthur Pendleton's map had 13 tacks, but those were only the victims he had personally cataloged since he took over the Blackstone workshop in 1981. The 3 cavities beneath the Monroe Street switchbox belonged to the older era, the era of his father, Thomas Pendleton, who had ruled the Illinois Central Security Division with an iron fist during the labor strikes of the 50s and 60s. The hereditary nature of the slaughterhouse was no longer a theoretical connection. It was a physical, concrete reality that was about to be dragged into the light of a Chicago dawn. Back at the area's central holding facility, the atmosphere inside Interrogation Room 4 was suffocating. Arthur Pendleton had not moved a single muscle since the recording of his father's touch DNA on the steering wheel had been laid before him. He sat with his silver, military-cropped head bowed slightly, his cuffed hands resting heavy against the steel table, the links of his handcuffs drawing a long, dark shadow across the photograph of Michelle Carter. The arrogant, grandfatherly calm that had defined his early testimony was beginning to curdle into a desperate, silent calculation. He was a man who understood the mechanics of leverage, and he knew that with every turn of the forensic saw beneath the loop, his remaining currency was evaporating. Your father didn't just teach you how to use the high-carbon scribe, Arthur, Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register as she stepped back into the room, her hand resting on the heavy steel door frame. He taught you how to treat the city's veins as your private vault. He told you that as long as the concrete held, the transactions would remain silent. But he didn't count on the digital age. He didn't count on a podcast that could mobilize millions of investigators in the span of a single night. The people of Chicago are looking at the map right now. They're looking at the names. They're looking at the dates. And they're looking at you. Pendleton slowly raised his head, his pale blue eyes squinting against the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent tubes. His thin lips parted, a dry, rattling hiss emerging from his throat that sounded like dry leaves scraping across a concrete platform. You speak of the map as a crime, detective, Pendleton whispered, his voice shaking slightly with the first faint traces of an old man's fatigue. But that map is the only true record of this city's progress. Every name's on that list was a cost. Every red tack was a payment made to ensure that the skyscrapers you walk under remained standing. My father did not build that vault out of malice. He built it to preserve the contract. If the developers did not have the security guarantees, if the logistics lines were constantly halted by the unions or the inspectors, the capital would have fled to the suburbs. The south side would have been left to rot in the mud. I saved the history. I kept the records so that the families would know their daughters did not disappear into nothingness. They became part of the Steel. They became part of your father's pension fund, Arthur, Liam Vance said, stepping closer to the table, his hand rock steady on the grip of his camera. The red recording light blinked on the device, a tiny, rhythmic pulse of justice that seemed to count down the final minutes of the Pendleton myth. We've just received the preliminary audit of the Miller Industrial Transport accounts from 1992. The $75,000 a year wired to your father's shell company in the Caymans wasn't for security consulting. It was a retainer. It was a permanent, signed authorization from the development syndicates to neutralize environmental liabilities along the right-of-way. Michelle Carter was an environmental liability to them because she was going to expose the illegal toxic waste dumping inside the abandoned narrow-gauge lines. You didn't kill her to protect the city. You killed her to protect a corporate balance sheet. Pendleton's jaw tightened, the deep, weathered muscles along his neck flaring as he struggled to find a line of defense that could hold against the incoming digital tide. He looked down at his cuffed hands, his fingers tracing the small, dark grease stains embedded deep beneath his fingernails. The balance sheet is the only thing that keeps the lights on in your studio, young man, Pendleton said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that carried the heavy, generational weight of a family that had ruled the dark. You think you're a hero because you have a microphone and 1 million listeners. But you are only a tourist in the dark. You do not know the smell of the coal dust when the boilers are running at midnight. You do not know the sound of the iron when the trains are shifting in the fog. My father carried that weight so that you could have a city to write about. If you pull down his name, you pull down the very foundations of the streets you're standing on. The streets are already moving, Arthur, Elena Vance said, her phone buzzing in her tactical pocket with a persistent, urgent frequency. She pulled it out, her eyes scanning the text transmission from the forensic team at the Monroe Street site. The diamond saw just completed the first cut through the concrete switchbox. The seal is broken. The air pressure in the cavity has equalized, and the team is currently extracting the first zinc-lined locker. The label on the lock has her father's original Security Division serial number, ICR 1958-04. She leaned over the table, placing her palms flat against the cold steel, her face inches from his. We're opening the locker right now, Arthur. The live camera feed is being routed to the state attorney's office. What is inside that locker? Is it the ledger books from the strike? Or are we going to find the children your father cleared from the yards in 1958? The silence that followed was absolute, a dead, hollow space where the past had finally, violently collided with the present. Arthur Pendleton's eyes drifted to the small, silver transit whistle resting on the green felt pad on the table. The carved word silence seemed to reflect the harsh overhead light with a quiet, mocking intensity. The old machinist of Calumet had finally run out of railroad. The tracks had ended at a concrete wall, the signals were all red, and the final, devastating chapter of his family's 70-year reign of terror was about to be written in the blood of the system itself. The screech of the diamond-tipped concrete saws echoing through the Monroe Street municipal maintenance shaft was not merely an acoustic intrusion. It was the physical sound of an empire's final defensive wall being ground into dust. At exactly 5:35 a.m., the first localized seismic monitor placed along the active Red Line subway tracks registered a sharp, isolated tremor. The precise moment the hydraulic cutters sheared through the 3-inch reinforced structural steel collar protecting the second subterranean cavity. Directly above the extraction point, inside the Federal Command trailer, the hum of the high-velocity air-scrubbing units grew to a high-pitched whine as they fought to capture 40 decades of trapped, toxic coal residue, diesel particulate, and the damp, stagnant air of the forgotten loop drifts. Detective Elena Vance stood with her forehead pressed against the cold, vibrating glass of the command window. Below her, under the harsh, glaring beams of the multi-directional LED work lights, 3 forensic technicians clad in white, positive pressure protective suits carefully guided a heavy, hydraulic winch cabled down into the dark, steaming throat of the shaft. The mist rising from the street level was thick with the scent of wet asphalt, pulverized limestone, and a deep, biological decay that made the armed federal marshals guarding the perimeter shift their weight in silent, uneasy anticipation. Winch is secure on the primary hoist ring. The radio speaker on the command console crackled. The voice of the subterranean recovery lead tight with adrenaline. We are experiencing significant drag. The concrete around the base of the zinc locker has fused with the legacy cast iron support pillars of the old 1906 freight line. We're going to have to apply a localized chemical solvent to dissolve the remaining adhesive layer. Give us 4 minutes. Beside Elena, Liam Vance stood with his fingers hovering over the master console of his mobile digital transmitter. The live broadcast feed of the dead files of the Windy City was currently displaying a real-time, split-screen matrix. On the left, the dark, steaming maintenance shaft on Monroe Street. On the right, the clinical, silent interior of Area Central's Interrogation Room 4, where the silver-haired architect of the South Side's darkest secrets sat waiting for the final, devastating collapse of his world. The server load is reaching critical capacity, Elena, Liam whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes reflecting the rapid, blinking green indicators of the digital routing decks. Over 4 million people are watching this feed right now. The local emergency dispatch lines are completely jammed with calls from retired railway workers, families of missing persons from the 80s, and current city employees demanding to know if their daily commute is running directly over a generational mass grave. Let them watch, Elena said, her voice a cold, flat declaration of intent. For 50 years, the Pendleton family used the dark to keep this city quiet. They thought that if they buried their victims beneath the concrete, the passage of time would eventually turn their crimes into municipal history. But the light doesn't care about the concrete, Liam. It just waits for someone to turn the switch. Inside the interrogation room, Arthur Pendleton's watery blue eyes remained fixed on the vintage silver transit whistle resting on the green felt pad. The carved word silence seemed to capture the harsh overhead light, transforming it into a tiny, mocking point of silver fire that refused to fade. He could hear the faint, distant vibrations of the city's early morning elevated trains passing over the 35th Street Bridge, their steel wheels letting out a long, rhythmic screech that sounded like a mechanical scream in the quiet of the room. "You are a very patient young woman, Detective," Pendleton said, his voice dropping to a low, dry rattle that barely registered on the high-sensitivity microphones of the recording deck. He did not raise his head, keeping his gaze locked on the metal cylinder. "Your father was a patrolman in the 5th Precinct during the 70s. I remember him. He was a quiet man who kept his shoes polished and his notebook clean. He understood that the uniform was not a shield. It was a uniform. He knew his place in the system. Why didn't he teach you the same discipline?" Elena stepped back into the room, the heavy steel door swinging shut with a deep, muffled thud that cut off the distant sounds of the command center. She sat down in the metal chair opposite him, her hands folded flat on the table, her shadow completely enveloping his cuffed wrists. "My father taught me that a badge is a promise, Arthur," Elena said, her voice carrying an unyielding, clinical stillness. "He taught me that if you see a monster walking through the neighborhood, you don't build a gate around him. You don't take his money to pave the avenues, and you don't write his name in the official registry as a civic partner. You hunt him until his legs give out, and then you put him in a cage where he can never see the sun again." "A beautiful sentiment for a high school graduation speech," Pendleton whispered, a thin, paper-thin sneer touching the corners of his lips. "But your father didn't have to keep the boilers burning during the blizzard of 1979. He didn't have to stand on the elevated platform at midnight and watch 5,000 freezing, angry steelworkers march toward the municipal offices because their pension funds had been liquidated by the state administrators. My father did. He stood there with nothing but a wooden nightstick and a silver whistle, and he turned them back. He saved the city from its own rage, Detective. And he did it by making sure the logistics line stayed open, no matter how many bodies had to be cleared off the tracks." The winch has cleared the lip of the shaft, the command radio suddenly exploded, the voice of the recovery lead rising in a sharp, frantic crescendo that filled the interrogation room with an electric, terrifying energy. We have visual confirmation on the first zinc-lined utility locker. The serial numbers match the Illinois Central Security Division manifest from June of 1958. But Elena, there's a secondary inscription welded onto the underside of the carrying handle. It's a date, June 4th, 1958, and there's a hand-engraved name, Thomas Pendleton. Elena reached forward, her fingers tapping the digital interface of her tablet, instantly routing the live, high-resolution video stream from the recovery site to the monitor mounted on the wall of the interrogation cell. On the screen, the wet, black metal of the zinc locker emerged from the steam like an ancient, industrial sarcophagus. The surface was heavily pitted with rust and coated in a thick, gelatinous layer of dark grease, but the structural integrity of the container remained entirely intact, preserved by the high-density epoxy seal that had insulated it from the subterranean dampness for 68 years. The recovery team had placed the locker on a clean, white steel table inside the secure containment tent, their pneumatic tools positioned to cut the vintage mechanical latch. "Open it," Elena commanded through her transmitter, her eyes locked on Arthur Pendleton's face. The old machinist's eyes drifted slowly toward the screen. The absolute, psychopathic detachment that had protected his mind for 40 years was beginning to show its final, terminal fracture. The skin along his jawline twitched rhythmically, a tiny, involuntary pulse of panic that betrayed the desperate, silent calculations running through his head as the hydraulic cutters began to shear through the brass lock of the 1958 container. With a sharp, metallic pop, the latch gave way. One of the forensic technicians stepped forward, his gloved hands slowly lifting the heavy, zinc-lined lid. The camera angle shifted, looking directly down into the interior of the locker. The space was not filled with old paperwork, ledger books, or the legacy corporate records of the Illinois Central Railroad. Resting on a bed of faded, oil-stained security blankets were three small, beautifully preserved wooden drafting cases, their brass hinges oxidized into a dull green crust. Beside the cases sat a vintage 1950s leather camera bag, its strap rotted into a dry, fibrous powder, and a neat, stacked pile of pocket diaries, their leather covers stamped with the logo of the University of Chicago's Department of Labor Economics. But it was the object resting at the very bottom of the locker that made the air inside courtroom 402 and the living rooms of 4 million digital listeners turn into an icy, paralyzing silence. It was a small, child-sized winter coat, its wool fabric still retaining a faint, faded shade of navy blue, its brass buttons carved with the seal of the Chicago Public Schools. Tucked into the front pocket of the coat, its polished metal surface still reflecting the bright light of the forensic camera, was a third vintage silver transit whistle, identical in every detail to the one resting on the table in interrogation room 4. "That coat belonged to 10-year-old Bobby Jenkins," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the immense, crushing weight of a half-century of unresolved grief. He disappeared from the 47th Street rail yards on a Tuesday afternoon in June of 1958. His father was the lead organizer for the transit strike. The police told his mother he must have hopped a freight train to St. Louis, that he was just another runaway who didn't want to live in the soot anymore. "But your father didn't let him run, did he, Arthur? He didn't put him on a train to St. Louis." Pendleton's hands shook, the heavy steel links of his handcuffs drawing a series of rapid, chaotic clicks against the metal table. He looked at the child's coat on the screen, his watery blue eyes widening with a sudden, childlike terror that seemed to age him 20 years in the span of a single second. "It was a security operation," Pendleton muttered, his voice cracking, his gravelly baritone losing its mechanical cadence, leaving behind only the raspy, broken tone of a dying man who had finally been dragged into his own grave. The strike was going to freeze the entire Midwest, detective. The trains were carrying the coal for the steel mills. If the boilers went cold, the iron would solidify in the furnaces, and the mills would have been ruined forever. My father had to stop the organizers. He had to show them that the line was not a political stage. He had to show them that the tracks had teeth. By taking a 10-year-old boy, Liam Vance's voice was a low, burning hiss from the corner of the room, his hand trembling on the grip of the camera. By killing a child and sealing his coat in a concrete vault beneath the loop to ensure his father would call off the strike? We didn't destroy him, Pendleton suddenly screamed, his head snapping up, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness as he surged forward against the restraint chain, his handcuffs clashing violently against the steel table. We preserved him. We kept him in the log. We gave him a permanent place in the structure of the city. He's been safe down there for 70 years. He didn't have to grow old in the dirt. He didn't have to see the mills close. He stayed pure. He stayed part of the line. Elena stood up, her face pale, her expression a mix of profound horror and absolute, unyielding victory. She reached down, picked up the vintage silver transit whistle from the green felt pad, and placed it inside a secure plastic evidence bag, sealing the zipper with a sharp, definitive snap. "The line is closed, Arthur," Elena said, her voice echoing in the sudden, dead silence of the interrogation cell. "The concrete has been cut, the lockers are open, and your father's legacy is officially dead. You're going to spend the rest of your life in a concrete cell 40 feet below the ground, just like the girls on your map. But nobody is going to write your name in the log. Nobody is going to keep your memory safe from the weather. You are going to dissolve in the dark, and the tracks will move on without you." As she walked out of the room, leaving the old machinist of Calumet alone with his ghosts under the harsh, unblinking glare of the fluorescent lights, the first true light of the Chicago dawn broke over the peaks of the high-rise office towers, casting a warm, golden glow across the wet, ice-slicked pavement of Monroe Street. The 70-year-old silence of the South Side rails had finally been broken, the red tacks had been pulled from the map, and the city, built on the bones of the forgotten, was finally, beautifully beginning to breathe. Part 11. The digital counter on the master console of the Federal Command trailer flickered to 6:12 a.m. Outside, the transition from night to day was not a gentle awakening, but a cold, metallic expansion. The freezing sleet had finally stopped, leaving the asphalt of Monroe Street glazed in a hard, mirror-like crust of gray ice. The early morning light struggled through the heavy lake fog, casting long, distorted geometric shadows across the barricades, the generator trucks, and the silent, wet helmets of the federal marshals standing guard. The street was empty of civilian traffic, but the air remained thick with the steady, mechanical vibration of the ventilation systems still forcing 40 feet of subterranean history up into the freezing morning sky. Inside the command trailer, the silence was absolute. The live broadcast feed of the dead files of the Windy City had not disconnected, but the chat interface had slowed to a crawl. The sheer, devastating weight of the discovery inside the 1958 zinc line locker had left the massive online audience in a state of collective shock. On the main monitor, the split-screen display showed the empty chair in Interrogation Room 4, where Arthur Pendleton had finally been led away to a secure holding cell under maximum suicide watch. On the other half of the screen, the high-definition camera inside the Monroe Street containment tent remained focused on the small, navy blue wool child's coat, its brass buttons catching the bright, artificial glow of the forensic work lights. Detective Elena Vance sat at her desk, her tactical jacket unzipped, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee she had forgotten to drink. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale with the immense physical and emotional exhaustion of a 48-hour run that had systematically dismantled a 70-year-old dynasty of municipal execution. Beside her, Liam Vance stood leaning against the steel partition, his digital audio recorder resting on his knee, his eyes fixed on the empty screen of his laptop. "It's not just a cold case anymore, Liam," Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, quiet register that carried the profound weight of the morning. "It's an excavation of the city's soul. My father went to his grave believing that the department was a clean machine, that the bad gears were always replaced. He didn't know that the machine itself was built on a foundation of bones. The machine survived because it had a monopoly on the silence," Liam replied, his voice hoarse, his fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against the aluminum casing of his recorder. "But that's the thing about concrete. It eventually cracks. All it takes is one small fissure, one voice that refuses to stop asking the right questions, and the whole structure starts to crumble under its own weight. We didn't just find Clara, Elena. We brought them all back. The legal aftermath of the midnight arrest of Arthur Pendleton was already moving with a rapid, unstoppable momentum through the high corridors of the Cook County Judicial Department. By 6:30 a.m., the state attorney's office had officially approved the emergency consolidation of 13 active capital homicide charges into a single, multi-generational federal racketeering and civil rights conspiracy indictment. The Department of Justice was preparing to assume control of the prosecution under the federal color of law execution statutes, ensuring that no local political influence or legacy developer alliances could interfere with the trial of the century. But the work at the Monroe Street site was far from complete. The recovery team was currently preparing to breach the second and third subterranean cavities mapped by the ground-penetrating radar. We've secured the hydraulic winches for the second lift. The lead engineer's voice crackled through the command trailer's intercom, his tone professional, clinical, yet carrying a distinct, nervous edge. The second cavity is located slightly deeper than the first, positioned directly behind the primary masonry arch of the old Illinois Central coal siding. The thermal signatures indicate that the concrete layer surrounding this vault is identical in composition to the 1992 pour we analyzed at the Calumet bungalow. This is the era of the transition, Elena. This is where Arthur took over the tools from his father. Elena stood up, pulling her tactical belt tight, her eyes locking onto her brother. Let's go down. I want to be there when the seal is broken. They navigated the narrow, slippery metal stairs of the maintenance shaft, their boots echoing off the cold iron walls as they descended 40 feet beneath the streets of the loop. The air grew rapidly colder, thicker, and saturated with the heavy, chemical tang of the concrete solvent and the ancient, frozen dampness of the underground narrow-gauge rail lines. The workspace was a chaotic hive of bright yellow industrial cables, portable ventilation tubes, and forensic technicians clad in white protective suits, their faces obscured by the reflective plastic visors of their respirator masks. The second concrete vault sat in the center of the lateral drift, surrounded by piles of pulverized limestone and rusted iron brackets that had been sheared away by the diamond-tip saws. The forensic team had already cut a clean, rectangular block out of the outer concrete layer, revealing the dark, oxidized surface of a second zinc-lined utility locker, this one bearing the serial number ICR 1992-11. We are preparing to release the vacuum seal, the lead technician said, his hand resting on the valve of a specialized air sampling canister. The interior pressure is significantly higher than the ambient tunnel atmosphere. We're going to extract the headspace gas first to analyze for volatile organic compounds before we open the latch. With a sharp, high-pitched hiss of escaping air, the pressure equalized. The technician stepped back, signaling to the two operators holding the hydraulic cutting shears. The heavy brass padlocks, rusted into solid lumps of green metal, were snapped in a fraction of a second, their broken pieces falling to the concrete floor with a heavy, hollow clink. Liam raised his handheld camera, the lens focusing on the lid as it was slowly pried upward by two gloved hands. The interior of the 1992 locker was a terrifyingly precise mirror of the first, but the items preserved inside reflected a different, more sophisticated era of obsession. Resting on a bed of clean, blue wool railway blankets was a collection of personal items that had belonged to Rebecca Vance, her leather-bound historical research journals, her laminated Chicago Historical Society identification badge, and a gold-plated fountain pen that had been engraved with her initials. But next to her belongings sat a secondary, smaller container, a vintage wooden cigar box, its cedar surface darkened by decades of subterranean moisture. Elena knelt down, her gloved fingers carefully lifting the lid of the cedar box. Inside sat a collection of 23 brass transit tokens from the 1950s, each one meticulously wrapped in a small piece of grease-stained paper. Written on each paper wrapper, in the dark blue iron gall ink of Thomas Pendleton, was a date, a location along the South Side line, and a single, handwritten female name. This was the original ledger of the strikes, the physical proof of the disappearances that Rebecca Vance had uncovered in the archives before she was systematically silenced by the old machinist and his father. The registry was real, Elena, Liam whispered, his camera tracking the names on the wrappers. Every token was a transit ticket for a passenger who never arrived. They kept the tokens to prove to their developer partners that the corridors were clear, that the obstacles had been permanently removed from the right-of-way. They kept them because they believed they were gods, Elena said, her voice shaking with a quiet, icy fury. They believed that as long as they controlled the tracks, they controlled the history of this city. But they ran out of line, Arthur. The train has finally stopped. At exactly 7 a.m., the third and final concrete cavity was breached. This was the deepest vault, cast into the very foundation of the old Monroe Street station platform. Inside the zinc-lined locker ICR 2003-10, the team recovered the physical evidence that would seal Arthur Pendleton's fate in a federal court for the rest of his natural life. The personal, leather-bound journal of Clara Hughes, her university research folders, and the original high-carbon steel machining scribe used to sever her spinal cord in the Hyde Park alleyway. The weapon had been preserved in a clean, oil-stained cloth, its tip still holding the microscopic, dried residue of her blood, a perfect, undeniable forensic match that no defense attorney could ever challenge. The recovery of the 3 lockers was complete. As the heavy crane trucks began the slow, loud work of hoisting the historic evidence containers up to the street level, Elena and Liam stood on the steps of the Dirksen Federal Building, their coats zipped tight against the freezing mountain winds blowing off Lake Michigan. The sun had finally broken through the high gray clouds, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the ice-slicked high-rises of the Loop, turning the concrete of the city into a sparkling, clean white canvas. "What happens now, Elena?" Liam asked, his camera finally turned off, his hand resting in his pocket. "We go back to work," she said, her voice carrying a deep, emotional warmth that seemed to cut through the freezing morning air. "We have 70 years of files to reopen. We have to find every family on that map, and we have to give them their daughters back. We have to make sure that the names of the people who built this city are written in the light, not hidden in the dark." She looked back toward the open mouth of the maintenance shaft, where the forensic teams were still working in the steam. The long, freezing winter of 2003 was finally over. The silence had been shattered, the tracks had been cleared of their monsters, and the city of Chicago, built on the bones of the forgotten, was finally, beautifully beginning to breathe. 2 weeks later, the sky over the South Side Cemetery was a brilliant, cloudless blue. There were no television cameras, no political press releases, and no high society city council members gathering under the trees. The crowd was small. Only Detective Elena Vance, Liam Vance, Judge Arthur Vance, and a handful of elderly residents who had never forgotten the girls who had disappeared into the soot. At the center of the green lawn, a beautiful, polished granite headstone sat bathed in the warm, golden light of the morning sun. It did not bear the dusty, anonymous label of a cold case folder. Carved deep into the stone, in elegant, clean letters, was a name that had finally been restored to the light. Clara Hughes. August 14th, 1984 to October 24th, 2003. The snow has cleared. The tracks are silent. The passenger is home. Elena stood by the grave, her hands tucked deep into her pockets, watching as a single, fresh white rose was placed against the base of the stone. The cold case of 2003 was no longer a cold case. The circle was closed. The predator was locked in a concrete cage of his own making, and the truth, 70 years in the making, had finally, beautifully set the city free. The quiet of the South Side Cemetery did not signal an end to the work. It was merely the calm before the largest systemic and institutional trial in the modern history of the state of Illinois. By the spring of 2026, the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago had been transformed into a virtual fortress. High-security steel barriers lined the perimeter of the Dirksen building, television satellite trucks blocked the adjacent lanes of Dearborn Street, and armed federal marshals stood guard at every entrance. The public, which had lived for over half a century under the carefully constructed illusion of safety curated by the old industrial and municipal guard, was demanding a complete, unvarnished accounting of the rot. Detective Elena Vance sat in the witness preparation room on the 4th floor, the morning light cutting sharp, geometric angles through the blinds. On the table before her sat the final, compiled trial brief, a document that had grown to over 3,000 pages of forensic data, financial flowcharts, decrypted audio transcripts, and physical evidence logs. The defense team representing Arthur Pendleton had spent the last 3 months attempting to dissect the prosecution's case, filing dozens of motions to suppress the DNA evidence, the wiretap recordings, and the contents of the Monroe Street and Calumet concrete vaults. But their efforts had been systematically dismantled by lead federal prosecutor Evelyn Reed. Pendleton is going to try to turn the courtroom into his personal theater, Elena, Reed said, stepping into the room and dropping a fresh stack of court transcripts onto the table. He's rejected every plea offer. He wants to take the stand. He still believes that if he can speak directly to the jury, he can convince them that his family's actions were the only thing that kept this city's industrial heart beating during the economic shifts of the 20th century. He doesn't understand that the city he thinks he's saved has already moved on, Elena said, her voice quiet, steady, and carrying the hard-won clarity of a detective who had spent months living in the dark with the family's secrets. The jurors aren't the developers or the railroad barons of 1958 or 1989. They are ordinary citizens who had to lock their doors for 30 years because they thought a phantom monster was walking through the snow and the steam. They don't care about his infrastructure contracts or his father's old commendations. They care about Clara. They care about Bobby. They care about justice. At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy oak doors of courtroom 402 swung open. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity. Reporters from every national news outlet, retired officers who had served during the transition eras, and members of the victims' families, including the elderly Judge Arthur Vance, who sat in the front row, his hands resting heavily on his cane. When Arthur Pendleton was led into the room, a collective, sharp intake of breath rustled through the crowd. He was no longer dressed in his denim work shirts or his machinist's apron. He wore a simple, dark gray suit provided by the state, his wrists secured by a subtle, beneath-the-coat transport chain that clinked softly with every step. Yet, despite the physical markers of his fall, he held his head high, his piercing, pale blue eyes scanning the gallery with the same cold, analytical authority he had possessed when he sat in the basement workshop of his Calumet bungalow. The prosecution's presentation of the case was a masterclass in clinical, chronological exposure. Evelyn Reed did not rely on emotional rhetoric or sensationalist declarations. She let the physical evidence speak for itself. She introduced the vintage silver transit whistles recovered from the lockers, detailing the microscopic toolmark matches that linked the carved word silence directly to the engraving scribe found in Pendleton's private workshop. She played the decrypted audio tapes of his detailed confessions, the cold, flat rattle of the old machinist's voice echoing through the silent courtroom like a physical blow. But the true climax of the trial came on the 5th day, when the prosecution called its chief surviving witness to the stand, Donald Vance, the retired captain of the precinct who had served as an operational coordinator during the 90s. Donald Vance was an old man, his face weathered by years of heavy drinking and the suffocating guilt of a lifetime of cover-ups. As he took the oath, his eyes kept darting toward the defense table, where Pendleton sat entirely motionless, his gaze locked onto his former partner with a cold, terrifying intensity. "Captain Vance," Reed asked, stepping to the center of the courtroom. In December of 1989, immediately following the murder of Melissa Vance, did you receive any direct, verbal instructions from the Pendleton family regarding the management of the Cherry Creek crime scene? Donald Vance swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand. He took a long, slow breath, looking away from Pendleton and focusing on the jury box. "Yes," Vance whispered, his voice raspy, barely carrying over the quiet hum of the courtroom's microphone. The Pendletons came to the precinct before the first patrol cars had even secured the perimeter. "They told me that the snow was our window." They said we had to get the body processed, and the scene cleared before the temperature rose, and the tracks started to melt. They personally directed the forensic team to focus on the outer perimeter, away from the specific footprints leading toward the pine trees where the vehicle had been parked. And the silver whistle? Reed pressed. Did you question why a vintage police whistle was found in the victim's hand? I knew what it was the moment I saw the crime scene photos, Vance admitted, a tear cutting through the deep creases of his cheek. It was the captain's whistle. Thomas Pendleton's whistle. We all knew what it meant. It was a signal. It meant that this wasn't a random street crime. It was a division matter. It meant we had to protect the pipeline. If the federal grand jury started auditing our accounts, we were all going to federal prison. So we kept our mouths shut. We routed the investigation toward phantom transients and drifters, and we made sure any detective who started asking the wrong questions was quietly transferred out of the homicide unit. Like Detective David Miller in 1994? Reed asked. Like David. Vance sobbed, burying his face in his hands. David wouldn't let it go. He had found the routing numbers for the offshore developer accounts. When he went missing, we were told he had committed suicide because of the stress. But when we found his car buried under the pool house slab during the federal raid last month, I realized that the Pendletons had personally ordered his execution. They used Jim Cole to do the job, and then they buried the evidence in their own backyard to ensure they would always have a hammer to keep the rest of us in line. The defense's cross-examination of Vance was aggressive, attempting to paint the retired captain as a corrupt, self-preserving liar who was fabricating stories to secure a reduced sentence from the federal prosecutors. But the damage had already been done. The physical reality of David Miller's rusted vehicle, combined with the matching fingerprints and the decrypted audio recordings, created an unbreakable chain of complicity that no legal maneuvering could sever. On the 8th day of the trial, against the explicit advice of his defense counsel, Arthur Pendleton took the stand. The courtroom was dead silent as the former machinist walked slowly to the witness box, his movements deliberate, his expression entirely composed. He did not look like a man on trial for capital murder. He looked like a statesman preparing to deliver a final, definitive address on the nature of power and the survival of the city's infrastructure. Mr. Pendleton, his defense attorney began, keeping his distance. You have heard the testimony of Donald Vance, the forensic reports, and the audio recordings submitted by the prosecution. How do you respond to these allegations? Pendleton leaned forward, his hands resting lightly on the wooden railing of the witness box. He looked directly at the jurors, his voice returning to that smooth, gravelly baritone that had commanded the dark corners of Chicago's industrial circles for nearly 2 decades. The law is a very beautiful concept on paper, ladies and gentlemen, Pendleton said, his tone conversational, almost paternal. It is an easy thing to sit in a warm courtroom in 2026 and judge the decisions made in the freezing dark of 1989 or the turbulent streets of 1958. But a city is not built by theories. It is built by concrete,